Okay. Thank you very much, Muskan, and thanks for all your work in connection with this panel. Let me begin this way. On this very day, we find ourselves amidst a critical juxtaposition. Today is Teachers' Day in India, but today in the USA is Labor Day, a day which has been promoted and marketed as a depoliticized holiday at the expense and erasure of the International May Day, which ironically has its roots in the United States. Following the May 1886 Haymarket Affair, when workers in Chicago were striking for an 8-hour workday. I find the previous panel of our colloquium on contemporary Indian cinema provocative for our current panel on the future of the universities. Professor Madhava Prasad, in his treatment of the evolution of Indian cinema, makes a distinction between a capitalist economy and a capitalist society. That is, a capitalist economy existing amidst pre-capitalist institutions, as distinguished from a more thoroughgoing capitalist society. He references a Tamil film, I believe it was Western Guards, that opens with a courier who carries messages and goods up and down a mountain. By the end of the film, the man who had been a courier has become a security guard, sitting immobilized amidst giant white wind turbines, thereby dramatizing the centrality of proletarianization in the construction of capitalist society. For us then, the question arises, what has become of the professor? What is the professor becoming? I have been teaching critical theory and alternative political economy for more than 30 years at the University of Pennsylvania, but I also served there on the executive committee of the American Association of University Professors, which, among other things, seeks to protect academic freedom and to support faculty, staff, students, and the surrounding impoverished community in their collective struggles for improving conditions of work and life. A significant obstacle in our organizing arises from the faculty's own self-conception. I will state the problem explicitly: the denial by the professoriate of its proletarian character. I'm very excited about this panel, and I turn it over now to Sonay Ban, who will moderate the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andy, for this introduction. Mine will be not as good as yours, I think, but I will just start. Welcome to the Future of Universities panel. I'm Dr. Sonay Ban. I'm a cultural and visual anthropologist based in Turkey, and I'm currently an editor at Susma Speak Up platform, a CSO, monitoring and documenting violations of freedom of expression in media and artistic freedom in culture and the arts in Turkey. Before providing some information on the order of things, I would like first to thank Professors Andy Lamas and Savita Singh for inviting me to this colloquium and kindly asking me to chair this panel. I also thank Mariam Rashid for her support and assistance along the way. So we have 3 panelists and a discussant. We will have 15 minutes for each presentation and 15 minutes for our discussant. Then we will open the floor for a Q&A and hopefully some concluding remarks, if time permitting. And I will just delve into to the panel, and I will just present our first panelist, who is Emre Çetin Gürer. Dr. Gürer received his PhD in philosophy from Villanova University. He's currently working as a lecturer at Koç University University academic writing program in Turkey. His research interests are critical space theory, philosophy of time and history, philosophy of race and gender, and urban justice. He holds BA and MA degrees in political science and international relations from Boğaziçi University, Turkey, and an MA degree in philosophy from Villanova University. He has written in journals and newspapers such as Public Art Journal, Bir Gün, Cumhuriyet, The European Legacy, and Mavi Posta. And the title of his presentation for today is University as a Space of Resistance and Prefigurative Agent of Change in Turkey.
Thank you, Sonay. I just shared a couple links on the chat box. First of all, I'd like to thank to the organizers for this wonderful collegium and for inviting me, particularly to FCSR. It's a pleasure to take part in the fruition of this idea of creative theory that I had the privilege of witnessing a part of her development over the last year. I also want to thank Andrew Lamas for coordinating this panel, and Mariam Rashid and Muskan Rajan for their organizing. Finally, thank you, Sonay Ban, for chairing and for your kind introduction. As Sonay said, my presentation title, sorry, I have a little technical issue. Just bear with me a moment. Okay, so my presentation title is University as a Space of Resistance and Prefigurative Agent of Change in Turkey. I'll be reading a short paper with 3 parts. First, giving a background on my focal point, Boğaziçi University resistance. Second, unpacking the space of resistance it creates. And third, claiming its prefigurative role in contemporary Turkey. So let me start. The social and political role of universities in a neoliberal society is a contentious issue. On the one hand, these institutions that are meant to facilitate the education of independent and critical citizens are restructured to produce neoliberal subjects and qualified cheap labor. Instead of pursuing research aiming to broaden scientific knowledge and humanities, universities are pressured to become profit-making think tanks addressing the needs of corporations and increasingly authoritarian state agendas. Thankfully, such neoliberal and authoritarian policies transforming universities are not left unchallenged. On the other hand of these forces, there are significant resistance in the form of labor movements, student movements, feminist, anti-racist, and LGBTQI+ movements, as well as those defending the academic freedoms and speech. The Boğaziçi University resistance in Istanbul can be pointed out as one of the leading struggles against the neoliberal and authoritarian transformation of the universities in Turkey. Being a public university known with its well-established democratic self-governance mechanisms and free and top-notch education to students from all classes and regions of Turkey, Boğaziçi has been struggling for almost 2 years against the governing conservative state-corporate alliance. In this presentation, I will focus on Boğaziçi University that was turned into a space of resistance and evaluate the transformative political potentials of such space-making. I will argue that the space produced by the resistance is potentially a prefigurative agent of egalitarian change in the society that instantiates a concrete utopia, a beacon of hope among the increasingly oppressive forces of state and neoliberalism. I would like to start by giving a brief background of the Boğaziçi University and the authoritarianization that has been affecting it in Turkey. I would like to refer you to Zeynep Kadirbeyoğlu's presentation in the Future of the University conference happened in June in Istanbul for a much more detailed account. Please find that panel's video recording in the chat box that I just shared. Originally established as an American college in Istanbul, Boğaziçi University was nationalized and turned into a public university in 1971. Offering free and high-quality education to a diverse student body, Boğaziçi is famous for providing a vivid space for students to flourish as independent and critical minds with distinguished professional credentials as well as a robust humanities background. Also, as a leading research university in Turkey, it ranked among the first 500 in the world up until recently. Boğaziçi is also known to have a long tradition of democratic self-governing mechanisms that are decentrally structured to involve faculty and departments. Its rector is elected by the faculty, and their powers are restrained by faculty deans, department chairs, senate, and so on and so forth. This has distinctly been the case despite the establishment of the higher education institution known as YÖK in 1981, just after the 1980 coup in Turkey. After the military coup that cracked down the left, resulting in thousands of missing persons and imprisonments, shattering of institutions such as massive labor unions, political parties, and media outlets, the higher education institution was established to control universities that were deemed to be fertile soil for communist mobilization. Even though the constitution that was crafted by the military generals and ratified with a plebiscite in 1982, which is actually still in place by the way, this constitution, even though it seemingly defends university autonomies, in reality, universities were subordinated to the higher education institution by the higher education law that gives the authority to appoint rectors to the president and equips these university heads with excessive powers. This particular infringement upon academic freedoms was dodged away in practice by the Boğaziçi University up until 2016 with the presidential appointments of elected rectors only. So basically, the president was appointing the rectors who were elected by the faculty up until 2016. However, in 2016, with the dramatic change in the political climate, which Mine Eder calls as the democratic backslide in Turkey. And please refer to her presentation at the Future of the University conference that I shared the link on the chat box as well. So in 2016, the first non-elected rector, despite its opponent's election with 86% of the votes, were appointed. The same year, in January 2016, a petition known as the Peace Petitions, signed by 1,027 academics, of which I'm a member, led to a Red Scare by the government, resulting in charges with terrorism and purging of academics. With the July 2016 coup attempt, and what Ahmet Şık, the journalist and also a member of the parliament, Ahmet Şık calls the civil coup that follows the coup attempt, the government consolidated its powers, coordinated a massive attack to its political opposition, and intensified its grasp over the higher education institutions by increased faculty purging and prosecutions. Amid such turmoil, the protest voices against the rector appointment in Boğaziçi did not grow to become a movement, which was perceived to be an intermittent suspension of the democratic tradition, and also was appeased by President's selection of a quote-unquote palatable rector, who was a well-known and trusted figure from within the faculty. This, however, dramatically changed with the following appointment in January 2021, where a midnight decree placed Melih Bulu, a ruling party entourage unrelated to Boğaziçi, blatantly declaring the transformation of the university into a corporation. This being the final straw, Boğaziçi faculty penned its famous "We do not accept, we do not give up" declaration. In it, they called for a swift retraction of the current appointee and the reinstatement of the democratic mechanisms. After encounters with various delaying tactics and rejections, faculty and Boğaziçi committee began an active resistance against the rector, initially using the legal suits and intra-administrative mechanisms by the deans and senate. However, such deans and representatives were also dismissed by the rector, leaving no room but accepting defeat or continuing resistance in other forms. From this point on, already existing minor protests grew and other protests in various shapes and sizes began within and beyond the campus. On the one hand, faculty commenced vigils in front of the rectorate, turning their backs collectively and standing still. This weekly protest, reminiscent of the Standing Man protest in Gezi Park, still continues every Friday at noon, embodying the no vote of confidence given by 95% of the faculty to the rector. This was accompanied with massive student protests in and outside the campus, some leading to clashes with police, encampments, and creative interventions. With regular teach-ins, art exhibitions, costumed marches, collective dances, and performances, the rising movement turned particularly the campus into a festive iteration of the Gezi and Occupy sites. In the meantime, alumni in Istanbul around the world also joined ranks with organizing solidarity protests in their locations and online. As these practices of resistance and more continue, the backlash from the rector and the government heightened in the form of disciplinary procedures, suspended, detained, and even imprisoned students, canceled faculty contracts, club shutdowns, canceled events, and so on. Nevertheless, the resistance also had gains, most evidently the toppling down of the initial appointed rector. But this only resulted in the current top-down appointment, Naci İnci, who is the current rector, who is even more authoritarian and reactionary than Melih Bulu. Regardless of the current rector and the oppressive climate in the university, the resistance accomplished arguably a most remarkable achievement possible by a university in Turkey today. That is a space looked up to by all those who seek ways for resistance against the current government and an alternative to the current establishment. In a political environment where thousands of journalists, human rights defenders, activists, and lawyers are jailed, hundreds of thousands of court cases are open to those who simply speak up against the president or government, where oppositional media outlets raided and closed, parliamentary members are stripped down of their invincibility and jailed, where the head of the third biggest opposition party is imprisoned since 2018, and the head of the biggest human rights organization is in prison since 2017. Where all the branches of the state, including the judiciary, are controlled by one man who has his special forces on top of the military and police, where Amnesty International reported 3 torture cases in prisons and 2 forced disappearances in 2021, it is difficult to keep one's head up and enact dissent. Against all odds, Boğaziçi University is one of the few fortresses in the country where political dissent is publicly continuing. Its movement does not only express dissent, but at the same time produces a space of resistance that has become an emblem in the country, not only among the universities, but for the entire opposition. Here I'd like to unpack, when I use the term space and space of resistance, I do not mean to merely point out the campus establishment in Istanbul, where resistance occurs within a particular geographical coordinate. Instead, I use the term in its Lefebvrean connotation as a social space produced by relations in several layers, including the materiality of the location, but also on symbolic, representational, and experiential levels. Such a sense of the term helps encompass the multiplicity of forces and relationships that play a part in building the movement beyond the university while taking its center at the campus, as the campus. An immediate example is the international solidarity events that summons the university at their locations. Cihan Tekay reports from her interviews with activists who participated in these solidarity events in her article at the South Atlantic Quarterly special issue called Against Today, Universities as New Battlegrounds, on the Boğaziçi resistance. And you can also find its link as well on the chat box. And I quote from her, quote, when they get together in protests in squares across the world, being in this solidaristic community makes them feel like they are at the South Square, Güney Meydan again, the main gathering place of the campus, Boğaziçi campus, where the current resistance for university autonomy is also taking place. A Turkish doctoral student who studies in New York, who is not herself a Boğaziçi alumni, told me that Boğaziçi is a space of possibility for many, for those who hope to be able to find a place for themselves in society when they can finally return home from abroad. This echoed in the account of an engineer who is an alumni of Yıldız Technical University and works in Spain. She says she participated in the protests because she wants to be able to return to a country that respects human rights. A former faculty member who now lives and works in New York confirmed this sense that Boğaziçi symbolizes a space of hope, a possibility for many in Turkey. People tend to project their aspirations to it. Witnessing the last remaining institution that had managed to stay relatively autonomous from the regime now, from the regime now being brought under political control, affected many who felt this way, end quote. In the same fashion of the Gezi protests motto that everywhere is Taksim, solidarity events claimed that everywhere is Boğaziçi, and hence I would like to highlight again that the Boğaziçi movement is not limited to a campus activism, but it produces a political field, a space of resistance that resonates with other segments and forces in the society with which its interaction is taking part in its production. Such social and political space creation in a university is pertinent to discussions on the political role of universities, and I would like to argue that Boğaziçi is playing a prefigurative role at the moment. Most Marxists have a skeptical view on university being a progressive force in society. For instance, Louis Althusser famously argues that the education system is a part of the ideological state apparatus that reproduces labor power for capitalist exploitation. It enables the necessary skills for the labor market, while at the same time subjectivizes individuals to behave in concordance with the powers that be. Herbert Marcuse, in contrast, has a more optimistic view of education. While he's critical of the one-dimensional education that strips off critical potentials from students, he also defends a gradual transformation of the society, which he calls a long march through the institutions. When facilitated through a Bildung, the German word, like holistic education of critique and humanitarian values, Marcuse argues education, particularly higher education, can create the agents of progress and progressive change. I think Boğaziçi University is an example of such progressive force in Turkey, not only because it has been facilitating the emergence of such critical subjects, but also because it opens up a space that exemplifies an alternative politics, a way of education and living within a clearly oppressive environment. Such an example where people can speak up freely and criticize authorities that aim at transforming the university into an assembly line of conformant and conservative labor power, where LGBTQI plus individuals, people of color and women feel comfortable being themselves publicly, where solidarity economies often take over the high-priced cafeterias, for instance, the famous Starbucks occupation in campus, and capitalist relations are subverted daily, where art is lived in all genres as a way of resistance. Boğaziçi example offers a stark contrast to the status quo, along with a strong appeal to the currently dormant progressive forces in Turkey. This, I believe, is where this space of resistance turns into a prefigurative agent in Turkey that instantiates a desired alternative to the existing climate, while at the same time actively struggling against the forces that pressures to crush dissent. Even though Boğaziçi resistance today may seem feeble against the chimera of government, its beacon of hope and prefigurative example may perform as a catalyst in the way Marcuse described the student movements in the 60s, that can ignite a radical transformation in Turkey. I know my time is up, so just let me finish with a quote from the same issue of South Atlantic Quarterly, this time from Zeynep Gambeti, and I quote, "Resisting encroachments on academic freedom will not be a purely academic matter or a struggle concerning only academia. Constituting a new regime of truth, one that is inclusive and collective, requires prefiguring a model of politics other than the one that blurs the lines between critique, resistance, and terrorism. The Boğaziçi University resistance beacons such an alternative. This, I believe, is the reason it's summoned up so much solidarity as an embodied as well as intellectual promise of rehoming." End quote. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gürer. And it was 15 minutes, so it was just really timely. So thank you so much for keeping up with the time as well. And without spending any second, I will just go to our second panelist, who is Peter Bratsis. He's an associate professor of liberal studies and political science at the Graduate Center and at Borough of Manhattan Community College of the City University of New York. His publications include the books Everyday Life and the State and Paradigm Lost, State Theory Reconsidered with Stanley Aronowitz. He is also a founding editor of the journal Situations, Project of the Radical Imagination. He has published in numerous journals, including Social Text, Historical Materialism, and International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. And his presentation is entitled Financialized Capitalism and the Post-Fordist University, Notes on the Conduct of Universities by Speculators.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the Creative Theory Association for inviting me to be part of the panel, and of course, Antti and Sentin of the Marcuse Society as well. I'm very happy to be here, and it's participating in these internationalized events, really underscore just how universal the core problems are, that the problems being faced in Turkey or in Greece or the United States or in India are more and more and more the same problems, of course. The title of my talk is a play from a book by Thorstein Veblen, The Higher Learning in America, on the conduct of universities by businessmen, which is going to be a key reference to my comments today, because I think we are currently in the midst of a transformation comparable to the one that Veblen documented. You know, and Veblen's book is very much on the transition from universities from being a place of kind of intellectual craft work, where professors had a lot of autonomy and really were in control of the universities, to a kind of Fordist industrialized model. You know, initially universities, or what we know as universities today, begin as very vulgar institutions, which were simply training centers for clerics. You know, of course, the old famous universities we know, Bologna and Oxford and these kinds of things, were simply training schools for clerics to begin with. Is even worse than what they've become now. You know, they began even worse than the current moment, of course. Then they become, you know, in the course of the Enlightenment, they do become, I think, as Senton very much documented in the case of Turkey, places of refuge, liberation. You know, not for everybody, of course, for a very particular segment of the societies. You know, they were very small, but in the course of the Enlightenment, universities become a refuge from economic, cultural, social limitations, and become very much a place dedicated for learning for the sake of learning, knowledge for its own sake, completely uninstrumentalized in, not everywhere, of course, and not always, but in many ways. That changes in the early 20th century. And under the leadership of people like Andrew Carnegie and the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, there were grants given and money given to study how to improve the efficiency of universities, which led to a very important book and study being published in 1910 by a person by the name of Morris Cook, who was one of Taylor's proteges, with a title, Academic and Industrial Efficiency. And the suggestions of the efficiency experts was that universities were extremely inefficient because professors had too much power. There was too much power in the hands of the professors. And I think this very much ties into the Andy's comment that academics refuse to understand their proletarian nature, of course, which begins at this moment, you know, that people go from being relatively independent and autonomous intellectual workers to really in a kind of industrialized proletariat of what my friend Stanley Aronowitz called the knowledge factory. One of the suggestions, of course, was that, you know, that faculty be made less powerful, which led to a number of things. To begin with, it led to a separation of who leads the university from the faculty. The faculty becomes less and less powerful in the leadership of the university. You have this new class of administrators who run the universities. And as part of that, faculty become much more interchangeable. There becomes a standardization of the curricula. There becomes a standardization of the disciplines. So it no longer becomes Max Weber's seminars on economy and society. It becomes sociology 100 or 110 or whatever, you know. And if you advertise for a specialist, you know, we need someone who does sociology of culture, 300 people will apply, you know, you hire, you know, one of the 300, and it's very much like the assembly line. You know, the faculty become much less, not only nominally powerful in the university, but you become much more, have much less leverage over the runnings of the university because they are completely interchangeable. Everything is standardized. There are industrial measures used to, classes are measured by how many hours a week they meet, 3 credit classes, 3 hours a week, completely industrialized measure. To get a degree, it's 120 credit hours, so everything becomes internalized into that system, the industrialized quantitative models. And again, it's always very discouraging to see just how many academics have internalized this model and, willingly use these, you see that always there are for the students' requirements that are not substantive, but they are simply reflections of this formalistic industrial standpoint. So for most of us, I think this is the university that we know, that we grew up with, that we studied under. It was this model, but there were a lot of spaces and gaps where real education could take place. I will disagree a little bit with Sentin on this question of Althusser and the view of universities. Of course, the function of universities is fundamentally conservative. Even outside the question of the reproduction of capitalism. In a way, universities are inherently conservative because we are transmitting and reproducing the ideas of the past, in a sense. So it's an inherently conservative institution, not always, of course, capitalistic. But there were a lot of spaces where we could do things beyond simply reproducing the requisites for capitalist accumulation. In the cafeterias, in the libraries, in the bars, of course, what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney call kind of in the breaks, between the classes, outside of the formal institutions. There were a lot of those spaces. Things today become, of course, even worse than what we grew up with, what we knew in many ways. Because one of the limiting elements of this industrialized Fordist university was that most of the university administrators, the people who ran the universities, were largely academics who had, I always half joking, not fully joking, say to many of my colleagues, a lot of people missed their calling as supermarket managers and ended up in academia because it's a bit risky to be a supermarket manager. You might get fired. Academics, if they're one thing, they're risk adverse. They like the idea of tenure, of permanence. And so many people came into academia who should have been supermarket managers, and then in the course of their progression ended up as deans and provosts and university presidents and so forth. But at least they had that long-term connection to the institution. They worked their way up. They knew the requisites of academic labor. They were familiar with the problems and limitations. And at some point they ended up, in those positions, and then eventually they retire or whatever happens. But they have the connection. They were embedded within the community, within academia, and within that particular institution. That changes. Today we have, again, as I said, an even worse situation, which is that as reflective of this new moment of a financialized, speculative, transnationalized capitalism, more and more of the university administrators, number one, do not come out of academia. They come out of, there are lawyers, there are people who are basically fundraisers. They have a background in raising money for things. And they go from one institution to the other. They don't slowly work their way up the ranks. They come in, and if they stay at an institution for more than 4 or 5 years, it's a sign that they're a failure. Because if you're good, then someone else will want you and you will move on. If you're not that good, you get stuck and you stay for 15, 20 years, perhaps. And this is a very significant shift because, number one, it points to a different metric for how efficiency and the efficacy of universities are judged. And also, of course, in terms of individual careers. So there's a less embeddedness. They're much more likely to make decisions. that have disastrous consequences on the institution because their individual fates are no longer as bound up as the fate of the institution. And there are not so many examples of this. One just down the street here from me in Cooper Union, which, as some people might know, used to be free. It was tuition free for 100 something years, you know, very good university. And then people come in, you know, who administrators who don't have the connection to the university, who are careerists, who want to move on, and they are very happy to make decisions that in the long term are extremely destructive. You know, they had a very big financial crisis. Now they're charging tuition and so forth. And then they move on to their next position. You know, is my friend Konstantinos Tsoukalas compares it to buccaneers, you know, or nomads. You go in when you don't have the connection to the place, you go in, you destroy, and you move on. You rape, you pillage, and you move on to the next victim. You know, there's nothing lost by destroying that place. And again, more and more we have that situation. You know, as the kind of post-Fordist financialized model, this is one of the things that make the university even less open to how it was before. Second one that really, I think, narrows the range of possibilities is that the role of the student becomes less and less possible. You know, someone going to study today to the university really is presented as either a consumer or as an investor. You know, there is a complete flipping of the traditional Marxist formula that capital is dead labor. You know, as you know, of course, from the Grundrisse and other works, for Marx and the Marxists, capital is nothing, is labor that has already been actualized, and it takes a non-living form. The current model is the opposite, that labor is capital, that each individual student is an investor in themselves, going to create, you know, more value for the future. And the way to judge or to decide on how to study and what to study is how you can maximize returns for the future. How to maximize returns for the future. So for students, it becomes not a disinterested, let's say, right, knowledge for the sake of knowledge. To study properly, one must study in a way that you make yourself more valuable, marketable in terms of the labor market, and in a way that you can maximize returns in the future. That's why every year they have guides for students, what not to study. And they'll say, don't study art history because, you know, you'll have negative returns on investment. Don't study. So more and more then students come to see themselves not as students, but as investors in their own capital, or they come to see themselves as consumers. And there is a huge, of course, mechanism, as you know, for evaluating faculty and the various facilities on the campus. And that's then the kind of subjectivity students are led into, to see it as a matter of consumer satisfaction, how best to maximize your experience. You know, what is your the university as a kind of consumerist experience. And you have the current fascination then with all those things that lead to an enhanced, as it were, student experience, especially if that means you have to water down or decrease the academic content, the substantive content. You know, that will always be sacrificed in the name of enhancing student experience. And then, of course, with the pandemic, we have an even bigger limitation, which is how much of the content then of education goes online. So many online courses, so much online content, which on the one hand allows students to work more hours while taking classes, asynchronous online classes, and severely minimizes the possibilities that in the cracks, you know, in the breaks, in the in-between, something beyond the reproduction of labor power or, you know, happens. So it is an extremely, I think, pessimistic moment we are in. And what we see is a very clear need to retake control of the universities. That if we are to save the notion of higher education, higher learning, if we are to save some of, the more, because the Project of Enlightenment is not all positive, of course, but there are obviously positive elements to it. If we're to save that, we have to retake, the faculty have to retake the control of the universities, and we have to break the connection to the labor market. Because it was bad under the Fordist model of mass-produced higher education. It's even worse now in this kind of speculative post-Fordist moment. And we have to really have a break, with both models and get back to real students and faculty-controlled institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Praxis. Our final panelist is Avijit Pathak. He taught sociology at Jawaharlal Nehru University for more than 3 decades. And his talk will be along the following line of question. Is it possible to retain the spirit of epistemological pluralism and critical pedagogy in our universities at a time when the unholy alliance of neoliberalism and militant nationalism invades the domain of education?
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you, friends and colleagues. And today we celebrate Teachers' Day in the country. So to begin with, let me convey my best wishes to all of you, friends, colleagues, teachers, and the audience. This morning, because of Teachers' Day, just when celebrating it and began to reflect on the state of university, not only in the country, all over the world, and teaching, pedagogy, and education. Some kind of a conversation between the East and the West began to take place in my mind. On the one hand, from this part of the world, great educationists like Mahatma Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore, and Jiru Krishnamurti, and their radical ideas about education and the way they made us rethink education. I was engaging with that. And at the same time, 3 great books that emerged in the last 6-7 years from the West that came to my mind. And these 3 books are 2014, Henry Giroux, one of the leading proponents of critical pedagogy in our time, his masterpiece, Neoliberalism's War on Higher Education, 2014. And then the great philosopher, social scientist, Martha Nussbaum's great book, Not for Profit, Why Democracy Needs Humanities, 2016. And 2017, another educational philosopher's book, Ronald Barnett's The Ecological University, A Feasible Utopia. So these 3 books came to my mind, and some kind of a conversation began to take place between East and West. The radical ideas of education that we learn from people like Gandhi, Krishnamurti, and Tagore, and the ideas that these 3 books I'm talking about, the ideas that I learned from these 3 books. I would today, because the time is very limited, I would just make 2 or 3 significant points. The first point is that at this moment, when particularly in India, when we see not everything is fine with the state of university education in the country, on the one hand, growing attack on public universities, the universities and the sites of knowledge, which somehow were trying to retain the spirit of critical thinking and critical pedagogy, and growing attack on those. And on the other, the increasing growth and the mushrooming growth of what I would categorize as education shops, the newly emergent neoliberal universities, which look like malls with golf garden, with huge casino and cafeteria, and extremely marketized notion of education. And on the other hand, the growing attack on public universities that used to retain the spirit of critical thinking and inquiry. We live under these difficult circumstances. And under these circumstances, the question that I asked myself today on Teachers' Day, is it possible to reimagine a new university in the future? In the future, is it possible to save higher education and save universities? So the three books, Henry Giro, Ronald Barnett, and Martha Nussbaum, I talked about, that gave me two kinds of insights. One, these books helped me to evolve a critique of what is happening in our times. And second, it also gave me the insights to reimagine the future and to strive for the future and to fight for the future to save higher education and the university. Think of Henry Giro. Now the way he would argue, and he would come with a hammer and argue strongly and very passionately that the neoliberalism and its attack on critical pedagogy and higher education. As he would say that the way today knowledge is being reduced into mere training and a set of technical skill, and only one goal of education in the era of neoliberalism is to transform students into resources to be manipulated and modulated by the market and by the corporate forces. In other words, under these circumstances, when education is transformed into mere training or a set of techno-managerial skills in affinity with the market forces, then what happens? University loses its function, the function of critical pedagogy, the function of creating a new democratic citizenship, the function of creating a culture of nuanced debate and dialogue that would question the prevalent discourse of power and the dominant common sense of the age and equip young minds with a new possibility, with a new future to create a better world and a better civilization. So Henry Giroux, again and again reminding us of the prevalent social amnesia and the neoliberal fundamentalism and the social Darwinism and the economic Darwinism that characterizes our time and colonizes the domain of education. As a result, education with the critical pedagogy, liberating education, and emancipatory education experiences severe blow in the age of neoliberalism. And Henry Giro plead for very strongly for saving, for fighting the new battle, for saving education, and for creating a new culture of learning. Likewise, all of us have read Martha Nussbaum, extraordinary philosopher, teacher, educationist, thinker. Now, when Martha Nussbaum would argue not for profit, and she would say that one of the big mistakes we would make if we see education merely as a tool for the domestic product and for the economy. Because as she would argue, that one of the major goals of education is to cultivate democratic citizenship, create humanity, create a culture of debate, and create public intellectuals with civility, with a culture of criticality and the nuanced debate. And it is only this democratic citizenship that could save humanities. So the liberal arts, the humanities, the reflexive and critical social sciences, which today are in danger because of the increasing commodification of education and because of the popularization of very market-driven technocratic instrumental reasoning that seems to have colonized the domain of education. Martha Nussbaum's reminder and the warning that education is not for profit, and how, for example, education ought to serve a different function, create a new sensitivity, a new being for democratic citizenship. That, I think, is a very, very powerful reminder. And third, the book I talked about, Ronald Barnett. When Barnett would talk about the feasible utopia, it might look utopian, but there is still a possibility. We could fight for that. We could struggle for that. We could strive for that. And as he would argue, that the ecological university, not the market-driven university that we are seeing today. An ecological university is the university based on ethic of care, the university that connects different knowledge systems, that connects with the natural cosmos, the university that integrates reason and experience, integrates all the faculties of knowing, sees beyond mere technocratic instrumental reasoning and rationality. And as a result, the way Barnett would talk about the wisdom inquiry. And the wisdom inquiry is different from what we see today, that reduction of education and knowledge into a very reductionist, narrow, technical, specialized academic body of knowledge. As opposed to that, the kind of learning, the kind of education that sharpens the ethics of care, enables us to relate, to connect, to heal this wounded world, and to create a better world that Ronald Barnett would talk about. And imagine an ecological university in the coming era. And he would call it, it is some kind of a feasible utopia you and I ought to strive for, ought to fight for. It's not a daydream, it's a feasible utopia. Now, when I learned from these three books this morning, I invoked these three books. And I invoke these three books as I reflect on, because I believe that there are two kinds of crises that confront the age you and I live in. And these two crises, one is that the way a huge body of critical sociological thinking is reminding us of what, Ulrich Beck and sociologist Anthony Giddens and the like, they would characterize us that we are living in a risk society, characterized by climate change, climate crisis, global warming, emissions from the nuclear reactors, the large-scale use of pesticides in the food crop, and the age of war and militarism. And at the same time, another kind of crisis that we are seeing from Donald Trump to Putin, from Russia to India, the cult of narcissism and the rising authoritarianism that we see all around. And in such a scenario, that how we rethink university, reimagine university as a site of resistance, enchanting the young minds and students, giving them yet another dream of a new possibility, beyond market-driven neoliberal instrumental reasoning, beyond the confines of hyper-nationalism, and to create a new humanity, new democratic citizenship, and the public intellectuals, university as a space for possibility and a new art of resistance. And I think that's a question that confront all of us as students, teachers, educationists at this moment of crisis. And as students and teachers, you and I ought to really contemplate on that, think over it, and it's a huge battle, and it's a long battle, and it's a battle that you and I ought to strive for, to save education. If our classrooms die, if our classrooms are devoid of a nuanced art of debate and dialogue, classrooms without fear, classrooms without surveillance, and if we fail to cultivate the ideal of the democratic citizenship, then the future is doomed, and we would move towards a dystopian age with large-scale market-driven neoliberal technocratic rationality, hyper-nationalism, and the surveillance state. And it is in this context, we are under this extremely difficult circumstances, be it India or the West or the United States, educationists who think differently, imagine another world, ought to come forward and strive for another future. And that future, to use Ronald Barnett language, it's a feasible utopia you and I ought to strive for a new humanistic, ecological university that activates critical thinking and generates democratic spirit of democratic citizenship. So on Teachers' Day, today as we celebrate Teachers' Day, I just urge, especially the young audience here, the students present here, to celebrate the dream. And the generation that has lost its dream is doomed. It is only this dream for a better world that would make us move. And what authoritarianism and neoliberalism has done is that it has deprived us of the dream of another possibility, dream of another world. And it is this dream that has to be restored today. And that's the function of emancipatory critical pedagogy and education. So that's it. Time was limited. I just shared some of my point with you. Thank you very much for bearing me, listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patak. Now we have almost half an hour left, and it's time to introduce our discussant, Mark O'Brien. I just want to give a short introduction, and then the floor is yours, Mark. He researches and writes on the history of social revolt and working class movements in the UK. He's the author of When Adam Dealt and Eve Span, A History of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, and Perished the Privileged Orders, A Socialist History of the Chartist Movement. His current interests include theorizing the state of the British trade union movement today. He's also an evaluation researcher at the University of Liverpool, and he's active in the UCU University Union.
Okay, thanks, Sonay. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to the conference organisers for giving me the chance to attend and participate in this conference. It's such an important question, the future of the university. And as the panelists have said, it's a universal theme across globally across the higher education system. We're all asking the same questions and facing, on different levels of intensity, I think it's important to say, the same sorts of problems and challenges. I think my role as discussant is, as I understand it anyway, is to perhaps tease out some of the commonalities across the three amazing presentations, all so fascinating, drawing out different aspects of the challenges that we face, and perhaps to touch on some differences of perspective and to try and sort of set up some discussion for the session. Before commenting, and my notes are a bit scattered, so I might jump around a little bit, so you have to bear with me. But before commenting on the papers, I just want to note how apposite Andy's introduction was. I didn't fully appreciate it when he was putting it, but it's very clear now. This juxtaposition of Labour Day in the States and Teacher Day in India, which really does frame our discussion very, very appropriately, where we have on the one hand the traditions of the labour movement, of workers' struggle, of collectivism and so on, and resistance, and on the other hand, really important and intense discussions about pedagogy, about the value of learning, about what we represent and what we are as educators, and what values we hold to and defend, and having to defend those values in the context of neoliberalism, of the drive towards corporatism in the universities. Enough. So the first paper, Sessions paper, was an absolutely brilliant presentation. I have to say as well, I found it quite humbling. You know, I mean, in the UK, heaven knows we have our problems, but there's a level of courage, I think, in the struggle in the universities in Turkey and at Bolji University, which I think it's important to acknowledge and to salute. Actually, there's a level of even, I would say, physical courage in some aspects of the story that the picture that Setin was presenting. But to note that shift in the political context in 2016 at Bolji University, the election of the first non-elected rector was obviously a hugely symbolic moment. And the following the Red Scare, the civil coup that Setin described, but also the hope and the resistance, the declaration, we do not give up. That struck a chord with me. We do not give up. Even though we're under this pressure, we know what the erosion of academic values is and what it means, and we've seen it. It's so terrible, and the effects on the culture of learning in the universities is so awful, and yet we don't give up. We persevere. We organize, we continue to resist, we continue to hold up those values that I think we're so invested in as radical educators. I liked also when Seton talks about the space of resistance, and this is not simply a material space, it's also cultural, it's symbolic. So it means that Bolshoi University is not simply a place where academics still defend radical educational and research values, but is also looked to by other academics at other universities, at other sites. There are these universities, aren't there, that have these reputations for holding out. We could also point to JNU University in New Delhi, I think, a place I visited. So there are these universities which, despite everything, keep that struggle going and keep a beacon burning for academics, perhaps, who are having an even worse time in other places. Or he talked about the university being a place of hope and a political field, an arena in which academic and other types of struggle can take place, including there was the idea of art as a way of resistance. That's a fantastic concept, and also the idea of a catalyst of resistance. Peter's presentation I found absolutely fascinating. One thing that I felt Peter was doing, actually, I hope Peter agrees with this, is that he was cautioning us not to idealize the past, because we're so aware of the terrible effects of neoliberalism, let's say, you know, since the 1980s onwards. And yet, isn't it always the case, certainly throughout the 20th century, that universities basically tracked state policy and have always been linked in one way or another to nation building, to the direction of social legislation. Of course, certainly in Europe, in the post-Second World War era, there was a progressive aspect of that with the rise of welfarism, the expansion of education, the investments in health, and so on and so forth. And universities were very much engines for that progressive social era, albeit under capitalism, but nonetheless gains were made and universities were part of that. So it's never been the case that, well, perhaps in the, you know, if you want to go back to the Enlightenment era, and maybe it's different. But for much of the history of the university system, it has in one way or another tracked state policy. But yes, the worsening of the situation for academics that Peter describes was so important, and is definitely, certainly, obviously a common feature, a common theme across each of the presentations. I would only add to and I was really interested in the comment on decision making, and the fact that university senior managers very often are increasingly disconnected from any kind of academic route in their own personal careers and in terms of how the institutions actually work. And also, it was very resonant with me the way Peter commented upon whether they move around. They don't stick around for more than 4 or 5 years. And I love the description of buccaneers. That rang true to me. I could add names to that description from Liverpool, believe me. Yes, they don't stick around for more than 5 years, particularly the vice chancellors, and they are on super salaries. Super salaries. You know, I mean, the concept, isn't there, of feudal capitalism? I don't think it's a particularly useful phrase myself, but it's resonant in universities, because there's a sense that people at the bottom of the pyramid on the short-term contracts, on the low incomes, are working to make the senior managers rich. That kind of upward flow of wealth to the vice chancellors is very, very easy and very exposed for all to see. But yes, the harmful decision making, the lack of investment in the institution, so important to draw that out. And Abhijit's presentation, again, I mean, the discussions there about Henry Giro, and also I like the mention of Tagore. I've always been very impressed by that model of the classical ashram, the idea of a learning community, the idea that there's a group of people who are committed to learning, teacher and student, but of course, in the critical pedagogy tradition, they can change places. So in the pedagogical discussions that go on, the teacher can also learn from the student. There's a back and forth. Amjad also talked about the spaces for struggle, the ethics of care that we fight for, and ended by talking about the two kinds of crisis, the risk society, and he gave us a list of all of the very familiar risks that we face as a species on the planet, but also the rise of the narcissism and the new authoritarianism, and how the universities can be a site of resistance against those two crises. I love the idea of classrooms without fear. We have to fight for that, classrooms without fear, where critical opinion can be put and debated in a rational, open and safe way. Increasingly, that space is disappearing. We have to absolutely fight for that. And of course, Abhijit gave us the horrible but very true image of the danger of a dystopia that we're walking into. Okay, just a couple of very quick thoughts from me. Throughout all of this is the question for me anyway of, are we pessimists or are we optimists? Where's the balance? I don't know about anybody else, but for me that changes by the day. It depends on what's happening. I certainly find that, and that this is something that I would emphasize in the UK experience. In Britain today, I don't know if anyone pays attention to what's happening in Britain. I don't know how important we are in the world anymore, really. But anyway, in Britain today, there is a new wave of industrial struggle, of trade union struggle. Train drivers, postal workers, and university workers and other groups have been striking a lot. We're increasingly connecting. It's extraordinary. This is happening in my city more than other cities, actually. It's an extraordinary thing to observe, the way we're constantly meeting each other across different occupational groups. University workers are constantly on picket lines, constantly on protests and demonstrations. But I think it's important to note that it's not just industrial. So there's an academic aspect to this, and almost a kind of intellectualism of the picket line almost. And we saw this particularly in 2018, where we had extensive strikes and many academic collaborations were hatched on the picket line, because you had chemists talking to philosophers and historians talking to sociologists. It was an extraordinary phenomenon, and we've seen that continue. So one last thought actually I had, this is a little bit of an outline thought, but I'll bring it in anyway. When we're talking about critical pedagogy, and we kind of, we frame it in this kind of contradictory juxtaposition of fighting for spaces for critical thinking and critical pedagogy, but against the instrumentalization of learning, I think that reaches a particularly intense contradiction around assessment. So colleagues of mine, and I myself as well, have used critical pedagogy approaches. We can create the spaces in our teaching for that, but when it comes to the assessment, the institution wants to grade, the student wants to grade as well. So how can we fight for critical and authentic types of assessment in that way? There are ways of doing it, I think. So that's a bit scattered, I know. I've drifted all over the place. I hope it's warmed up the discussion. But for me, as I say, the question is, are we pessimists or are we optimists? So.
Thank you so much, Mark. And Mark actually was one of the presenters in our conference, Future of the University conference that we organized in June. So I'm shamelessly talking about that conference as well, and we linked it on chat, and you can go and check it, because he talked about the what they are doing right now in the UK, and it was fascinating presentation. So I just wanted to mention that. And right now we have 15 minutes, so we can open this discussion and we can have a Q&A. But as I was listening to all of the wonderful presentations, I was also thinking about like whether we should be optimist or pessimist or both, and how we can go from there. So I'm seconding basically Mark, and I think the presentations are kind of like, they are very balanced in the sense that we are seeing beacons of hope, but at the same time we are seeing the realities of what's happening. So it's a good amalgamation, I think. And I would just like to open the floor for questions and comments. And if you can just start talking, or if you feel comfortable, you can write your questions to chat box and I can read it, or whatever you want to do.
Yeah, may I raise a question?
Yes,
Well,
sure.
yeah, I think I was just thinking whether I'm a pessimist or optimist. I think I'm both, and I think that in the discussion, you gave us a diagnosis of the problem, that neoliberalism is the reason for decline of the universities. Then there is a kind of passionate appeal for not allowing the universities to decline. But the reality is that if neoliberalism remains for next 10 years, universities will decline. I don't know, we can raise the movement like the farmers in Punjab to stop universities from declining. I mean, we are witnessing JNU. We had a strong movement in JNU, and now there's a decline. There's a fund cut, massive fund cut. There are institutional changes, appointment policies are changing. So a lot of things are changing, and we don't have any control on that. It is a state-sponsored university, and if the government decides, in fact, I used to tell the students that we have all the freedom till the time the government decides to give us freedom. We always fought a friendly government, so therefore we did not develop any technique of fighting a government which is not friendly to us. So I do not see any possibility of survival of this model of the university. Nobody needs this university probably except common people. And neoliberal regime is not interested in that. So that's a pessimistic part of this. But I'm very optimistic about this also. I think what we call among ourselves, there are many bypass surgeries that we do in order to save the heart. And probably this creative theory colloquium is also a bypass surgery. I remember Professor Mohanty and I had long debate about this, whether we should have such kind of organizations within university or outside university. I don't think that we did not survive within university. We had to come outside the university. So I think what I see in India, a lot of new experiments happening outside the formal university structure. Couple of my students are working on what is called Swaraj University. And the Swaraj University model is very interesting. Not funded and not taking any fee, designing own courses and training people in different kinds of skills, and not marketable skills, but what they call life skills, so they can live better life. So there are several such experiments going on, I'm sure, and probably that is the future of a university. As you know that this university has evolved from somewhere, and it might go to somewhere else. I don't think it's going to remain there forever. I'm not sure if, and I would like to know from you, if you think that this model of university still remains very relevant for the kind of economy that is emerging, the technology, new technologies that's emerging. So do you think that with that kind of thing, this model will remain very relevant actually? Forget about whether the state supports us or not, will remain the only model through which we can produce knowledge and distribute knowledge.
May I ask a question on it?
Yes, it's just one thing. Was it a question for all of our panelists and discussant, or I couldn't catch it up, sorry.
Generally, anybody can answer, but more so for Brasses.
Okay. And yes, Savita, you can also ask a
Just a
question,
short-
and then maybe we can.
Because we have
Yeah,
little time, I'll only ask. See, these options of being pessimist or optimist actually do not allow us to examine the presentations that have been made more seriously or in a meditative way. We have to think, we are thinking about the university or higher education. What kind of new ideas are required for new universities to be built? Obviously, it seems not for us, those who are in the university or those who lead these universities, but for those who think that they can do without these universities in terms of perpetuating their power. I mean, we have to think whether these universities or this system has stopped producing the kinds of managers that they need to run the further level of industrial development or level of capitalist development in the world. Today, I think economy is global. So as was pointed out by, I think, Mark, that these situations are faced everywhere. These questions are for everyone living everywhere. Have we come to an end? This particular way of organizing our learning lives? Is this, or the ideas that are even presently, ideas that we discuss are not required anymore? What are those ideas that are required for new liberal economy to transition into a far more totalitarian economy? That is the thing that I keep thinking about.
Okay. May I ask a question?
So maybe, is it possible if our panelists and discussants first answer these two questions, and then we can take your question? Would it be okay?
Sure.
Thank you. So, any comments or responses?
I'd like to come in there. I mean, I was being a little bit shorthand when I was saying optimism or pessimism. Of course, any serious answer that we give to that question is very nuanced, and we have to have a very kind of balanced view. But thinking about the room that still exists for the model of the university, for the academic model of the university rather than the business model of the university. I'm just drawing upon my own experience locally at the University of Liverpool. There are actually some quite serious battles going on about things like form of governance. So we have a group of professors in our university, in our union, I mean, who are putting together a new strategy for Senate. I mean, the power of Senate has been eroded terribly. It's dominated by technicist managers, you know. But we are, because of the confidence we've gained from an industrial struggle, there's new thinking made possible for how the Senate can be won back for a more academically based way of governing the university. I don't want to idealize that, but it's something that is happening. I don't know how far we're going to get with that. One thought I'd also like to share is that all of this, I think, it kind of forces us to ask the question what we mean by learning itself, because modes of learning are historical. You know, when we talk about is learning possible in an authentic sense? Well, what that question means varies from one historical period to the next. So going back, you know, to the kind of early part of the 20th century, certainly in Britain, there was the model of worker learning, the autodidact, the self-education. There were the miners' library clubs, that kind of thing. There were groups of workers who would meet to read pamphlets, to read classical literature, that was part of working class culture. And it was eclipsed by the rise of the provincial university, really, in the 1960s. Well, from the 30s onwards, but particularly in the 1960s. So the actual mode of learning changed. Now, maybe that's the transition which we're marking in this discussion, a change in the mode of learning. The kind of learning that happens in the university we know is changing, and not for the better. But I do believe there are other modes of learning happening. I mean, the internet is awash with types of learning and types of communication that were unimaginable 20 years ago. So maybe our difficulty answering this question, optimism or pessimism, is because the jury's still out about what learning means and where we're going with learning. And perhaps that's something that we need to focus on rather than just the negative aspects of what's happening in the institution.
So we don't have much time. And if there are responses to these two questions, we can have them, and then we can have the question from Manoranjan Mohanty, and then we can go on, because like time is so limited.
May I also ask a question? May I ask a question?
So let's first ask Manoranjan Mohanty to ask his question, and then you can ask your question, and then we can have the answers to them.
Charles also wanted to ask a question, I guess. Charles also wanted to ask a question. We can extend by 5 minutes. We should take his question.
Okay, then.
May I now?
Sure.
Yes, you can.
Well, I will declare that I am an optimist. And history makes me so, and even today's presentations, the Turkish experience and, Charles' whole episode, history and so on. But I have a question to the panel. What, in your view, is the concept of the university? Is it an institution of state, as rulers would like to have it in some ways, in many ways? Is it an institution of the market, as capital would have it? Or is it a social institution to fulfill a civilizational need, which requires autonomy for experimentation, innovation, as well as conformity and productive techniques for rulers, and therefore, just as there will be a school that the system needs to reproduce itself, the system needs the university, and the knowledge can never be stagnant to serve even the ruling class, and therefore the contradictions have to be explained, understood, and resolved to some extent to keep the society moving. So what is your concept of the university? And that will determine what new sources, new spaces will definitely come up. Not only the physical resistance spaces, but also pedagogical, and also different kinds of spaces for struggle, innovation, and creative intervention. So what is the concept of the university that you have in your mind?
So now we can have the other question, and we can go from.
Thank you very much. My question is directed to Professor Abhijit Pathak. You have, sir, made me half optimist. You have given us an alternative view of education to create a new democratic citizenship by university education, which is being threatened, which is being challenged today. The question is, do you see any alternative within this university system, or you think that something like what Manindraji is suggesting, some alternative university system, or do you think that education is not an independent variable and it has to fight for the reconstruction of society along with that, and only after in that fight, in that struggle, in that resistance only we can hope for and be an optimist for a new kind of education and a new kind of university education. Thank you.
So any of our panelists or discussants to answer the two questions?
May I start? Shall I
Yes,
jump
you
in?
can.
Thank you so much. There were so many great questions about the pessimist and the optimist question. I also want to declare that I'm an optimist as well, even though I think that being pessimist is more realistic. I cannot help. But this reminded me of the quotation that Ulaş Bayraktar actually read to us in that conference that we were organizing with Sonay, and Savita and Charles and Andy and Mark were all presenting. Andy was organizing with us as well. So Ulaş Bayraktar actually quoted from this book that I just picked up from my shelf, Bülent Şık. It probably can be translated as the stories that connects us or links us to Earth, to the world. And he was saying that there is a quote that he really loves from this book, which is that hope is not something that we need to have in order to act, but we gain hope when we act. Through practice, through action, we actually become hopeful. And that stuck with me. I mean, I didn't notice that, didn't know about that quotation, even though I had the book and I must have read it a bit shallowly. And that really stuck with me. And I really think it is my way of approaching to this question of optimism and pessimism as well. I feel like even within like extremely pessimistic environments, if you continue struggling and if you continue act, as Mark was pointing out, I think hope also comes with it, and it gives you further power and further motivation to continue struggling. His second question was also very interesting. He said talked about this assessments. What are we going to do about critical pedagogy, and if we are contrasting critical pedagogy with instrumentalization of learning, how are we going to solve this question of assessments to students? And I don't have a quick answer to that, but I really subscribe to the idea that instead of trying to evaluate students based on the point systems and like pass-fail grades, I feel like real learning happens when students actually try to create something that is useful outside the world. So if it is writing that we are teaching, I think they should like try and write something that is meaningful and that can be read by other people, not just by their professors. I'm teaching writing in the university. That's why I'm giving this example. And I have to grade my students' papers and give them grades at the end of the semester and so on and so forth, which is unfortunately not a system that I want to continue. I'm just like teaching this massive courses like Peter was describing, the 101 courses. Like basically cheap labor for the university, for actually a private university that are charging enormous amounts to the students. And I don't think it is the assessments, the kind of assessments are really helping students learn, and they are more focused on how to find ways to pass and finish with university and so on. So I think there are a lot to talk about. And then there was another question about the digital online learning, if it's going to stay. I really don't know if it's going to stay, but I actually want to kind of second that question Peter was asking, like the cracks, the gaps that we have in the university system, that as we were growing, which is actually shrinking, and what's going to happen with it, and what's actually what's happening right now with the online education, with the digitalization of it. I really agreed with Peter in the sense that these cracks, these areas that real education is happening, is shrinking, which is very disconcerting. And I actually want to kind of throw the question back to everyone who would like to answer, and also maybe to Peter, if they think about of ways to grow these cracks, grow the area for real education to happen while this digitalization is happening. These are all I want to say. Thanks.
Yeah, to respond to that and to the question before on if the university is still fits with the economic requisites of the moment, I think is it's more complex than that, because of course on fundamental levels, the university still is very fundamental when it comes to the economy. You know, not only of course as a site of producing specialized labor, but also in terms of technologies and research and so forth. Nonetheless, the question, in the same way that the bridges are fundamental to the economy and the infrastructure, but we are at the point where this disembedded university or this disembedded capitalism no longer seems very capable and willing of putting in the money for these long-term investments. So the same way you see, you know, and again, you know, around me there are various huge public projects, works from the era of the 1930s and the 1940s, you know, the Lincoln Tunnel, the George Washington Bridge, and so forth, that now they can barely maintain. They can barely keep them from falling down. So when they had spent huge amounts of money, you know, when they passed the New Deal legislation, it was equivalent to 80% of GDP in that year. Today, when they talk about, you know, Joe Biden had this idea of Build Back Better, which was 3.5 trillion, you know, the estimate, when the US economy now is around 24, 25 trillion. And that was seen as obscenely large amounts. So when you're at this point in time, the question is not whether the university still fits. And again, it obviously does in many important ways. But if the system is capable, you know, if this disembedded, financialized, post-Fordist capitalism is capable of putting in those resources. And here I will say that always the causal mechanism was not some enlightened bourgeoisie that would say, let's spend the money for the university. It was the class struggle that mediated and obliged capital to make these kinds of, which in ways that were functional to capitalism, perhaps in the last instance, but at the same time, you know, I think back to the great book by Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation. You know, this double movement he refers to between the struggle from below and the struggle from capitalists for a completely disembedded capitalism ended up in a process that was much more livable, much more effective as a mode of transition from feudalism to capitalism, and made capitalism more healthy. So here again, we have to be, I think, pessimistic, because we see that these things happen because the struggles from below become less and less effective. You know, not everywhere, not at all moments, but more and more and more, the struggles from below become less effective, and the transformations taking place now. You know, students going to becoming consumers or individual capitalists investing in themselves. The digitization, you know, the fact that everyone is now mediated through, human relations are so mediated through the screens, and the kinds of alienations this creates. You know, the objective conditions make the kinds of struggles that happened in the past less likely. You know, in my own institution, City University of New York, which was free but very selective, things opened up in 1969 because the students got together and they set fire to the Great Hall at City College. And they said to the then governor, Rockefeller, either you give us open admissions or we burn the university down. That was not only possible, it happened, of course, in 1969, but the state acquiesced. Today, I think if we ever got to that point where the students would set fire to the buildings, the police would probably shoot them rather than, saying, okay, we give up, you win, we'll give you open admission. So it's a new terrain, much more difficult. The possibilities for struggle are more remote than they were in the past. And really, we have to be very, very courageous, diligent, if we have any hope of changing the direction of how things are going.
So now I have to interject one thing. Lest people misunderstand Peter's pessimism, he's responsible for creating and operating two of the most important alternative critical pedagogy spaces around right now, the Marxist Summer School in Greece and the Institute for the Alternative Imaginations programs online. And I just wanted to, just counterbalance a little bit of the pessimism with the reality of Peter's work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was told that there's a roundtable which probably started right now, so we have to be quick. And I'm so sorry that I have to cut this wonderful dialogue and wonderful panel, because it seems like we didn't have enough time to cover everything. But if there is no comment or question that any of you would like to say.
May I just take 30 seconds and respond to it? Respond
Yes.
to the question? Yes.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Thank you. I think Professor Manindra Thakur, Professor Mahanti, and Professor Tandem, but just since time is limited, I would just respond to the question of optimism versus pessimism in a way, as Antonio Gramsci taught us. This is a constant dialectic between the pessimism of the intellect versus optimism of the will. So I think that we all, as educationists, activists, concerned citizens, pedagogues, are constantly passing through this dialectic, pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. And I think it is through this constant dialectic, certain possibility of a creative intervention emerges. And that creative intervention is the lamp in the world of darkness, in the age of darkness. And we should not be altogether indifferent to that small lamp that you and I can create in our classrooms through our resistance, through our protest, through our writing, through our engagement with students. And I think that is the way I respond to it.
Thank you so much. And
I think most of them are optimists. Yeah. Most of them are optimists. Mark, you were right to have asked this question.
Yeah, I was going to say that I'm on the side of the optimism, and I think we are all kind of optimists, so that we gather together right now and we are talking about whether we are optimist or pessimist. And I think that speaks for itself. And I'm so happy and honored and privileged to be here. And I am so happy that we have this panel. And because time is limited, we have to end here. But thank you so much for your contributions, for your participation and listening to us. And thank you so much for organizing this colloquium and this panel. And have a wonderful day, have a wonderful evening, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the speakers and also to the chair for conducting the session within the time. And now I think I'll hand over the charges to Mariam, who is going to conduct the session, the roundtable that is going to happen. So Mariam.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 9th Creative Theory Colloquium. This is the first roundtable of the colloquium on aesthetics, ecology, and feminism. I will hand over the charge to the coordinator for the for this session, which is Professor Savita Singh. But just before that, I would like to clarify a few questions that the chair had for me, which I was not able to do over email. The session is 2 hours long, and since we did overshoot, we're going to adjust accordingly. Every speaker will get 15 minutes to present, and I'll be making a note of the timings and then telling the chair about the same. And if any speaker does overshoot their time, the chair is requested to intervene. So with that, I hand over the reins to Professor Savita Singh, and she'll introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Mariam. Am I visible?
Yes, ma'am.
So thank you very much. I think towards the end of the day today, we kindly have come to this stage where we're going to have roundtable. As you know, the topic, the discussion is aesthetics, ecology, and feminism. These are very important and rich concepts, and very important within the critical theory discourse. Creative theory has also been thinking about it and writing about it, and we have come together to discuss, see where do we meet, where do we differ, what is the way forward, is there a way for us to work together on this concept, find a real meaningful dialogue way forward. So the panel is extraordinary. It's going to be introduced by Charles Wright, who's going to chair this roundtable. And I'm really looking forward to, it won't have paper presentation, it will have discussion. We'll have initial positions that will put forward, and then the discussion will take place. So it is much more discursive than like the previous sessions where we actually most welcome, just welcome the panel which is here. I can see Marilia, I can see Sarah, who's going, oh, Sarah is going to chair. I'm so sorry. Sarah Surak is going to chair the session, the round table, and Craig is here. Charles, I don't see, but she'll be around. So the people who are going to get into the discussion are already here. And of course, Sarah is here to lead us. So most welcome.
Hi, thank you, Savita. Greetings to everyone. My name is Sarah Surak, and I'm a professor of political theory at Salisbury University in Maryland. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces on the Zoom screen, and I appreciate everyone that's attending from from the Indian time zones. For example, I know this is late in the evening, but I think it'll be a nice way to wrap up the first day of this fantastic conference. In this session, we'll hear from a number of scholars who are each thinking deeply about critical theory in the future. And in doing so, they'll engage a wide range of topics central to the vision of and quest for a liberated world rooted in aesthetics, ecology, and/or feminism. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speakers today in the order that they will speak. We will begin with Dr. Craig Leonard, Associate Professor at NASCAD, or the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in Canada. We'll then hear from Dr. Charles Wright, Professor Emeritus, Kansas City Community College, Maria Pizona, Professor of Philosophy at the Federal University of ABC in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And then we'll conclude with Dr. Savita Singh, Professor of Gender Studies and Development at Indira Gandhi National Open University, who's also coordinating the session. We just heard from her. After the 4 presentations, Dr. Pushpa Singh, Professor of Political Science at the University of Delhi, will give commentary. And then we'll have around 20 minutes, or I guess since we're the last panel of the day, as long as we kind of go, or before we lose steam or people have to leave, I want to respect people's times for questions. We do have a packed schedule. I will give a 3-minute warning to our speakers. And then at the end of the 15 minutes, I will unmute my microphone and help to introduce the next one. I know we all have amazing things to talk about, and I'm very excited to hear from everyone, but we're already starting a bit late. So I encourage people to be kind of aware of the time so that we can hear from everyone and have a discussion. If there's no other sort of comments, I will go ahead and pass it over to Craig. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello to everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this exciting discussion. I'm speaking to you from Nova Scotia, Canada, on the margins of the continent here. Let me just jump right into the presentation I have, and I'm hoping to leave some substantial time to leak into discussion. So I've titled the title I've given to this talk is creative revolution or reform, which you may recognize as an adaptation of the collection of interviews titled Revolution or Reform that placed Herbert Marcuse in confrontation with Karl Popper. As a footnote, the face-to-face discussion planned for television by Bavarian Broadcasting ultimately did not take place between the two, which you may know. The editor of the German edition interviewed both separately and wove the answers together in a counterpoint fashion. But to the main point of the paper here, in this debate between Marcuse and Popper, Marcuse was the revolutionary who argued for the total dismantling of the West's repressive and oppressive capitalist dominance in favor of a new society built on a cooperative ethos of fundamental human goodness. Popper was the reformist who believed capitalism, although with its injustices and inequalities, had allowed for the flourishing of an open society, using his term, based on liberal democratic values that supported freedom and fairness as best as human-made institutions would allow. As stated in the books afterward, the theme of both philosophers was, quote, more freedom, justice, and humanity for Western democratic society, and ultimately, of course, for all societies of the world, unquote. From within their different frameworks, Marcuse argued that these conditions would only be achieved when individuals realize the false consciousness under which we unwittingly live, and only thereafter could we collectively resist the repressive influence of the capitalist establishment, which this normalized false consciousness serves and supports. Popper, on the other hand, argued that the state and social institutions that emerge through democratic processes are best situated toward positive change by methodologically identifying actions that produce undesirable consequences while allowing for the formal and procedural altering of those actions over time. What does this debate have to do with the subject of creativity, which is the subject of this panel? As I submitted in the short description for the panel, I wanted to raise some questions on the tensions between tradition and innovation, the new and the old, the familiar and the strange. I wanted also to link socio-political arguments to aesthetic, artistic, and creative ones. So in the aforementioned debate, we have, on the one hand, Marcuse, a proponent for radical change, and Popper, a defender of measured reforms. I ask, how do these diametric ideological poles translate to a creative framework? In terms of creativity and creative production, how does radical change as a complete deviation from the known and measured reform as a more preservative approach given to existing forms and techniques align with their socio-political analogs? Furthermore, how does artistic creativity actually manifest in real time? And I can ask that question as an artist and a teacher of art at the school where I'm based, the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. Do or must creative acts produce disruptions that are formal or technical, which I use to include techniques and technology, that significantly reorient our attention? Or does creativity proceed more methodically through the stepwise alteration of formal and technical traditions, preserving in part the forms and techniques that preceded? Let me propose that these poles may be reconciled, and this is for debate and discussion. Let me propose that these poles may be reconciled to a single and practical aesthetic concept, defamiliarization. which through repeated exposure and practice is capable, I believe, of producing a cognitive plasticity that concretely translates from the aesthetic dimension to a political one. Even more boldly, I'm willing to assert that creative defamiliarization is indirectly political. Being on this panel and being invited and being a member of the Marcuse Society on the whole, it would be no surprise that I am a Marcusian, not a Popperian. It seems true to me that Marcuse's social analysis punctures through the normalization of repressive social structures, while Popper's conservatism is likely to preserve them. Significantly, at the center of Marcuse's socio-political theory are aesthetic concerns. For Popper, in contrast, his concerns are the scientific method. Let me briefly sketch out the way defamiliarization works and its relevance to Marcuse's aesthetics. In Marcuse's 1967 lecture, later reprinted that same year in Arts Magazine, Marcuse referred to, quote, the aesthetic form of estrangement, unquote. That was captured by the Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky's notion of defamiliarization in translation into the English, in which he states art obscures the familiar forms, unquote, in order to concentrate attention on the object's uniqueness and difference. For Marcuse, defamiliarization not only identifies artistic value, that is, in his terms, art versus anti-art, which we'll leave for another time, but also serves as a practical technique that links the aesthetic dimension with the political transformation of the individual, which in Marcuse's words, quote, can perhaps best be illuminated by discussing the change in the social use of instinctual energy, unquote. Accordingly, it is an openness and attention to direct experiences with defamiliarization that transforms an artistic technique into a socio-political counter technique by subverting the habitualized consciousness of the everyday. The defamiliarizing capacity of art, therefore, performs a significant part in resisting the rationality that undergirds advanced capitalism through, quote, the active constitutive role of the senses in shaping reason, which is to say, in shaping the categories under which the world is ordered, experienced, and changed. That quote is from Marcuse. Defamiliarization operates as a liberatory technique by reimagining the limits imposed by habitualized common sense. Practically, then, the defamiliarizing capacity of creativity challenges dominant common sense, which enables a form of plasticity that is constituted by what in a thing can change. As a result, aesthetics plays a pivotal role in what Marcuse called the Great Refusal, by recognizing and subverting the habitualized common sense that makes alternative frameworks, perspectives, and practices seem mistaken or even irrational. Artistic creativity in this sense, however, is, and I will conclude on this, no substitute for direct political action. As I'm sure my co-panelist, Professor Wrights, who I respect deeply, would concur. Even though aesthetics can be, even though it can be a significant precursor to it. Let me repeat that. Artistic creativity in this sense, however, is no substitute for direct political action, even though it can be a significant precursor to it. As Marcuse states in Counter-Revolution and Revolt, I'll end with this quote, art can do nothing to prevent the ascent of barbarism, but it is indeed the internal exigency of art which drives the artist to the streets for all revolutions which have the historical chance of liberation. But in doing so, he or she leaves, or they, leave the universe of art and enter the larger universe of which art remains an antagonist. I don't want to use up more time than that to present a paper. I'd like to pass the baton to the next speaker, Charles, but or leave this, I guess, the remaining time. I'm not sure what that is, Sarah, but for maybe discussion even after this point.
Yeah, it's about 5 minutes, but maybe if we can go through each of the papers, then we won't get sidetracked by a fantastic discussion of yours and then need to cut it off and come back. Is that okay,
That's great.
Craig?
Of course, that's great.
Okay. Fantastic. And so we will, thank you, Craig. We will move on to Charles. And please.
Well, hello, everyone. And again, I thank all the conference organizers for making this colloquium possible. And let me just try to quickly jump in on the concept of defamiliarization that we just heard about. You know, that rings true to me in terms of educational philosophy. There's a section of Hegel where he says, just because something is familiar does not mean that it is known. To know something requires that we kind of dissolve all of the blocks of what is familiar into the historical context and the flow of time and et cetera. So defamiliarization, I think, is a central concept in educational philosophy since Hegel, and since that famous phrase about the teacher, leave those kids alone. You're just another brick in the wall. You know, to the extent that you're just producing what is familiar and reproducing what is familiar, you're reproducing the established order of unfreedom in the society. So freedom requires this defamiliarization. And then to Savita, in the last session, we had a great discussion about higher education. She was saying, what are the new ideas that higher education needs? You know, if there's a problem with neoliberalism, okay, well, you know, there was also a problem with liberalism. We don't want to, one of the speakers emphasized, we don't want to idealize the liberal university. The study of the humanities in the liberal university was also characterized by a politics of race, a politics of gender, and a politics of class. And that, so Marcuse was not just a proponent of an unreconstructed liberal arts university education. Marcuse looked for the free spaces that could be created within the university system, within the cracks of the university system. And I might say that in answer to Savita's question, what I experienced over the last 20 years was the multicultural educational reform movement, which courageously tried to reform higher education and K through 12 education by addressing especially these issues of race, gender, and class. And so this panel this morning about the relevance of gender and aesthetics and ecology is very much to the point, because we do have to rethink what higher education is about, what an education is about. And to that end, I wanted to kind of recap briefly what Marcuse offered in terms of creative ideas that have allowed us to rethink the liberal social order. And I've made a list of 8 of these ideas that I call his signature concepts. And let's start with number 1, one-dimensional society. And that advanced industrial society and its consumerist culture offer a plethora of mass-produced, commercially available, adjusted pleasures that facilitate a superficial life, a repressively desublimated happy life. We live, as Marcuse said, in a comfortable, smooth, democratic unfreedom. And in this unfreedom, the workforce tends to be absorbed in consumer society. So Marcuse rethought this, he wasn't just talking about business priorities that rule the liberal university, although that is what rules the liberal university, but the curriculum was in the one-dimensional university is kind of controlled and restricted, as Marcuse pointed out, to empiricism and behaviorism and linguistic analysis, and there was no place for critical social theory within philosophy departments. There was no place for Hegel within philosophy departments. So the one-dimensional society and the one-dimensional university, this was the liberal university during the glory days, I suppose, of capitalism in the American century, from the end of World War II to the 1980s. Well, you know, just as the multicultural education movement was kind of a form of resistance to the patterns of that prevailed, the discriminatory patterns that prevailed in culture and in higher education, Marcuse developed a kind of a counter current to one-dimensionality. And his phrase for this was the new sensibility. And I think that this panel represents what Marcuse was talking about in terms of the new sensibility. Marcuse defines the new sensibility as kind of the emergence of discontent from the left with regard to existing conditions, a countercurrent to the single dimensional American mind. The new sensibility, quote, is emerging today in the women's movement against patriarchal domination, which came of age socially only under capitalism, and in the protests against the nuclear power industry and the destruction of nature as an ecological space that cut across all fixed boundaries, and in the student movement, which despite being declared dead, still lives on in the struggles against the degradation of teaching and learning into activities that reproduce the system. So that's a nice, concise definition of what are the new ideas that we need? We need ideas that are critical of gender discrimination, critical of the ecological devastation, critical, and as one of the earlier speakers emphasized, all of this is kind of an outgrowth of class struggle that understands that we have to, that critical pedagogy needs to be on the side of the oppressed, and it needs to elicit the strengths of the oppressed in making a future of freedom. Now, that's the second signature idea. The third critical signature idea is the great refusal. And so a militant activist expression of system negation against all forms of domination. System refusal needs to become the unifying principle, the new general interest, a revolutionary strategy against the established order. So Marcuse's great refusal was and is meant to be our collective project, bringing radicals together powerfully today. Number 4, the critique of pure tolerance. Marcuse combated institutional racism by arguing that there should be no pure tolerance of hate speech, racism, anti-Semitism, or neo-fascist rhetoric. So it's a fallacy that we hear from the new right today to call for free speech and the tolerance of hate speech rather than the limitations on hate speech, the hate speech of white supremacists and anti-Semites, because in the perverted rhetoric of the alt-right, speech freedom ought to allow them the freedom to preach their hate, when in reality, the classical advocates like John Stuart Mill of freedom of speech saw this as a protection of powerless minority voices within a democracy, and that freedom of speech was to have a civilizing function, quote unquote, protecting dissent. And instead, we see that free speech is used to rally and promote the established and discriminatory powers that be. Now, and this, Marcuse also had a signature idea that there's a link between the erotic and the political. And this was expressed in a repressive way on the one hand and in an emancipatory way on the other. The repressive way is his notion of repressive desublimation. And this refers to the unrestrained use of sex and violence in commodity culture by large-scale commercial interests. Desublimation here means the removal of inhibitions, the removal of restraint on outbursts of hostility, rage, lust. Repressive desublimation substitutes reactionary emotional release in the place of rebellion. So Marcuse was thinking creatively about how shall we talk about our current circumstance. We need new ideas. And he developed, I argue, Marcuse was a Marxist, and his creative elaborations along these lines were the ways in which he wanted to raise Marxism to the highest level by addressing these dimensions from our position today. Now, the emancipatory connection between the erotic and the political is expressed in the promesse de bonheur of art. In other words, art's promise of happiness. Aesthetics for Marcuse is understood not primarily in terms of works of art, paintings or architecture or literature, but in terms of human sensuality and love of life, love of knowledge, love of justice and peace. Art is viewed through an emotionally informed and emancipatory political lens. So this promise of happiness that art and beauty provide is the token of a society as a work of art, and the society as a realm of freedom rather than repression. Now, there's two more ideas that I will quickly mention. Revolutionary ecological liberation. It's a key idea from Marcuse's last works. That Marcuse's works demonstrate a green turn that none of the other Frankfurt theorists undertook. And he emphasized how the destruction of nature under capitalism is responsible for the general destructiveness of capitalism is responsible for this destruction of nature. Lastly, and this is maybe what he saw as the most important thing, Marcuse was one of the only members of the Frankfurt School to write creatively and critically about the relationship of Marxism to women's issues. Marcuse appreciated the strength of the movement for women's equality as pushing beyond the immediate goal of selling one's labor on terms equal with men in the capitalist market. He lauded the feminist critique of toxic masculinity, the indictment of the male propensity toward violence against women, toward male domination in society. So let me conclude with just a statement from Marcuse that I think summarizes all of this as the new sensibility. Well, I'm not going to find it. I'll just leave it at that. Marcuse, I think, is a model of a creative thinker who was so immersed in the history of philosophy and in the history of oppositional movements that he could bring this to bear on the emancipatory ideas that we need for today, including higher education as well as direct action. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you for hitting on all of the themes of the roundtable. That's fantastic. I'm going to pass it now to Mariella to take us away. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, it's okay. Is it okay? Nice. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night for everyone. I am very happy to be here with you. I am grateful for this opportunity. I thank you very much, the organizer, and especially the invitation did by Savita and Andrew Lamas. And I apologize because I'm not fluent in English, but I will use all of my tools to make my speech understandable. So I share with you a link to read the paper with me. And I would like to share my screen. I am not sure if it is possible, but I would like to emphasize some words. I will try to, okay, it's perfect. Okay, share. Okay, it's nice. Okay, is it okay? Okay.
Looks good.
Is it okay? Can you see the image?
Yes.
Okay.
Looks good.
Okay, nice. So the title of my presentation is the Aesthetic of the Agroecological Revolution, Cultivating Images of Another Possible World. And I will begin to read and yes, okay. To the discussion proposed, I start with 3 references of Marcuse. From the text Ecology and Revolution, 2 ideas interested to me. First, the intrinsic relation between ecocide and genocide. And second, the image of a radical change as a change of the sensibility of the cycle of needs. From Ecology and Critique of Modern Science, I suggest that what Marcuse calls destructive character structure is a kind of culture that is already a kind of agriculture, materialized in some cultivation practices, namely the practices originating from the so-called Green Revolution. Finally, it interested to me to develop a proposal of a new science as a result of an articulation between art and science, technique and aesthetic, as indicated by Marcuse at the end of The One-Dimensional Man. This is one of the most controversial passages of the book. So this conversation offered the possibility to test some consequences that allow us an aesthetic of earth science. The biggest question that Marcuse leaves to me is, what another notion of a revolution can we bring from radical ecological practices as a major refusal of the Green Revolution? For that, we need to go to the practices themselves. Here, a new sensibility understood as an erotic and radical character can be derived. Now, I want to demonstrate that what Marcuse calls destructive character structure can be found in the industry of the modern agriculture. If you keep in mind that the Green Revolution tells a story of biochemical development linked to major worldwide events, which I have no time here to explain about, I would like just to share with you the board. Here in this board, you can see some data and types of pesticides connected with some historical events. So we have not time to explain about that, but we can see that modern agriculture industry, as a result of wars, is a structure of a destructive character. But I propose to go a little further, to discuss practices and technique, and to see in these seemingly neutral techniques and ethos and the logic of destruction, focusing on the most consumed and sold pesticide in the world, the most used one in Brazil, the glyphosate. It was introduced in the marketing in 1974 under the trade name Roundup. In Brazil, the Roundup is known as mata-mato. It is not simple to translate it. Mata means to kill. Mato is a general quality of weeds. Let's take a closer look at the name in English. What means Roundup? The gathering together to count, to control, to sold, for inspection, branding, or shipping. The term is especially used to domestic animals like cattle and sheep, and is associated with the practice of cowboys. But the term is used for people under suspicion by the police, collection of suspects or criminals by the police, especially in the raid. So, at this first gaze, we could associate the glyphosate to something that allows to put a person or things under control, arrest, capture, steal, plunder. In the biochemical process, the glyphosate works by blocking the action of plant-grown enzymes. It blocks the synthesis that would allow the plant to grow. It kills internally, acting on the biochemical synthesis of the plant. What does the glyphosate represent in human extension of scientific creation? What kind of sensibility it activates? I see in glyphosate as a representation of destructive affects such as asphyxia, control, homogenization, indifference, insensitivity, imposition, predictability. However, to really understand what glyphosate does, one must denaturalize years and years of a cultural industry dedicated to instilling in our minds the idea that modern agriculture is the most productive and efficient, the one capable of feeding the world. We need to move away from the naturality we need to move away from the naturality with which these products enter in our everyday life. Here, we also continue with Marcuse, who proposes to take things from the root, when what is at stake are projects of radical change. So we need literally to go to the roots, putting our head inside the soil to be able to see in another way. The knowledge that I will now present was systemized by Anna Maria Primavesi, who dedicated her life to construct another agricultural science connected with the fundamental assumptions of agroecology. So, first step, to decolonize agriculture, as we learned with Primavesi. The soil is not fertile, it is alive. An intense life inhabits the soil. Soil is not an inert mass consisted by minerals, serving as a mere support for vegetation, but a dynamic system of equal living organism. Second, instead of being composed just by minerals, the soil is formed by an intense life named rhizosphere. The process of agriculture in tropical soils depends on the activation of soil biocenosis. When a leaf falls into the ground and starts the process of decomposition, an entire fauna begins to work. It is this biological work that makes minerals available to the plant. the plant does not properly absorb chemical minerals. This is a mistake of modern agriculture, which reduces food quality, weakens the plant, and impoverishes the soil, initiating a cycle of dependence on the global capital state. So, the action of microbeings is essential for the soil life. As the tropical soil has been leached because it's older, because it got more rain, because the temperature is higher, it is poor in minerals such as nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. But how can trees be so booming in mineral poor soil? It happens because the tropical soil has a strong intelligence that depends on the associative capacity of effervescent biodiversity. 3. And consequently, for edaphic fauna to exist in the soil cannot be revolved, and the surface cannot be cleaned. Tropical soil is different from northern temperate soil. If it is moved or disturbed, it disrupts the balance of biological activity and destroys the clumps of soils. We are talking about the biological activity of bacteria, fungi, nematodes, mites, earthworms, who makes possible to clump the earth into lumps. This is very important in the tropical soil. Around these lumps, aggregated by an intense biological activity, the air and the water can enter into the soil, allowing the roots to breathe. 4. Yes, the root breathes. The leaf receives the solar rays that allows photosynthesis, but the plant does not breathe only through the leaves. She also breathes through the roots. The roots are the brain of the plant, full of nerve endings and neurosensory. They penetrate the soil and generate life, fulfilling the soil desire, which is mineral, to have life. The roots bring to sundown into the earth. In the tropics, roots are central. It is the association between roots and fungi that makes the tropical soil, the tropical forest, one of the most exuberant on the planet. 15 and last, the naturalization. And special fungus exist in the tropical soils. It is called mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza allows the plant roots to reach extension much larger than its actual size. Through the mycorrhiza, the plant communicates with the other around, exchanging information and nutrients. Mycorrhizas are networks that connect entire forest. They are conduits that carry messages between trees and allow communication, cooperation, and collective protection. Thus, the forests form a symbiotic community. Like that, mycorrhizas appear to be a hug skin that brings all beings together. It's not a skin that separates, in that poor idea of an individual. So we can return to our first question and ask one more time, what pesticide does? Taking into account the importance of associative cultivation with other plants as basis for life plant and soil life, the pesticide destroys the biomass's capacity to make the soil alive and to animate the decomposition process that would guarantee food for the microlife of the soil and the health of the plant. Pesticides are biocides because it kills the plant flora. In this narrative and the taxonomic record, herbs and microlife are known as pests, something to be eliminated. So I think I have just 1 minute. I would like to share with you that in Brazil, we have this mycorrhiza can represent to me the possibility of another kind of association between persons and plants, the association between person and plants named forest. So I would like just to finish to share with you this letter written by communities in Amazon, where they are denouncing the green solutions. And this is very important to the people that is in the north this moment. When you see the publicity of Amazon or Uber CO2 free, there are something that these communities can tell to us. So I have not time to read this big passage of this denouncing of green capitalism as a form of continuing in this reductionist science. So I finish with an homage to Vandana Shiva, this bigger fighter to ecology and feminist. You must engage in the right action. It's not yours to determine the outcome. So thank you very much. I will stop to share. Yes, okay.
Thank you so much. And we will pass now to Savita, our final speaker for today.
Good evening from here to everyone. Glad, Sarah, that you're here. Charles, Craig, Marilia. I must say that the last presentation by Marilia is very close to what I'm going to talk about. But before that, I would like to make small points, because this roundtable is about critical theory and creative theory coming together and seeing if we can form a critical creative path which will go forward, give us solutions in terms of critical reflections that we bring the problems that we're discussing. I think there's a large area of between us. I mean, I half belong to Marxist society and half to critical theory colloquium. So I'm kind of a bridge between these two associations, society, groups of friends. And I am, at least in this particular sense, quite optimistic that we will be able to work together, and none of us will have real theoretical objections or issues. Great. So the beauty of this whole roundtable session is that we see together in beautiful consensus that we create, because we do think that there's a lot to walk on, miles to basically, I would say. And if we come together, I think we'll be walk miles and miles. So let me start by saying that, because I'm going to speak on ecofeminism, Marilia has left quite a wonderful lead for me to, when she in fact ends with Vandana Shiva's quote, which is from Gita, by the way, that you do what you have to do, choose your right action, not worry too much about the outcome, because outcome will not be unjust. First thing is that creative theory wants that Indian context should be taken into consideration when we do critical theory. Why? Because there is a large area for us to agree upon, and there is much that we can enrich by way of understanding what is happening. Firstly, because we are connected by the destructiveness of capitalism, and that too through a mode of interaction which we call colonialism. So it is very important that when I or most of us in India, feminists, when we talk about feminism, we have to go back to destruction. that was brought about by British capitalism. First, and I'm sure there's going to be no disagreement. Second thing on which I will be reflecting in this roundtable is that overtaking capitalism, overtaking of production of life, the process of production of life by production of commodity. That is one relationship that we have to reverse or at least bring some balance. The third thing is how to restore ourselves, restore the damages that have been brought to our humanly imagined possible ways of just living. This I say because I think living itself, life itself, is under more serious threat than. So what I would say is that I just want to concentrate on Vandana Shivas because she's both Maridia and I agree on this particular eco-feminist and her ideas, even though she has been criticized for being essentialist. And what is that essentialism? Something that is present in Marcuse himself. I mean, we would call it, and we are calling it, I think, in Pinberg's writing, Andrew Pinberg's writing, it has been made very, very clear that there are some certain ontological drives that cannot be denied because there is a new theory that has come up which is anti-essential. Right? That drive is that human beings and all living beings tend to live out their lives. Say they need to be nurtured. Life extends itself to nurturing, certain sensible way of production of life and its nurturing. And this drive is erotic drive, which is life-giving, sensuous, life-giving, happiness-giving drive. It cannot be denied because it's still imagined something that will make us happy. And Charles just spoke about it. So I think Vandana Shiva starts from this. He thinks that nature is, understanding nature is like understanding clue. Nature gives us clue how life is produced and how it's nurtured. She has a lovely quotation in one of her books where she's quoting Dalai Lama, where he says that all life forms, including insects, aspire to live out their complete lives. And any force destructive which is emanation of death, thanatos, anything that dominates that life is not good in the sense that it will make our lives of the entire planet poorer, ultimately end the whole game. So there has to be a condition under which erotic drives, which some people want to call it essential, those drives have to be understood in terms of how life itself produces and reproduces itself. Vandana Shiva says that there's no other place, there's no other lab better than the forest itself, where you can go and see how life produces itself, how nature produces life, and how she sustains it. And that is why one of her earliest articles in which she talks about destruction that colonial forestry has brought. And the destruction is so intense that finally British government had to pass a law by which they took control of the entire forest. The destruction was so rampant and was so open that it could be only made invisible by taking control of the forest. She says, I'll just quote it, one of her earliest articles which I've taken illustration, quoting one or two passages from here, so you can see the intensity of feminist thinking as to how life is precious, how life is so demands so much care, demands so much conscious imagination and concrete action in the form of eco-social politics that is also on the table today. So is that the article is said colonialism and the of masculinist forestry. So when the British colonized India, they first colonized our forest. Colonialism, and as a metaphor, colonialism still persists in most of the places where forests are not under the control of people but under the control of the state. That is colonial or it is national. Ignorance of their wealth and the wealth of knowledge of local people to sustainably manage the forest, they displaced local rights, local needs, and local knowledge, and reduced this primary source of life. That is how forests also became places of dead trees. Women's subsistence economy based on the forest was replaced by the commercial economy based on the forest, the commercial economy of British colonialism. Teak from Malabar was extracted for the King's Navy. The sal of Central India, sal is also like tree, great timber tree rather. The sal of Central India and the conifers of Himalaya were exploited for the railway system. Although it is always local people who are held responsible for deforestation, commercial demands that have more frequently resulted in large-scale forest destruction. The Himalaya region, there is evidence that it was the needs of the empire, not of the local, that led to rapid forest inundation. And then she quotes a gadget here prepared by one of the forest officials. Is even more extraordinary. You can actually see the Indian forest, great tradition forestry India had, depleted, not only destroyed, but depleted. I mean, inundated. So in the gadget, Atkinson writes, the forests were denuded of good trees in all places. Destruction of trees of all species appears to have continually, steadily, and reached climax with 1855. The demands of the railway authorities induced numerous speculators to enter into the contract for sleepers that are built in the railway system. These men were allowed unchecked to cut down very far in excess of what they could possibly afford, so that for some years after the regular forest operations commenced, the department was chiefly busy cutting up, bringing to the depot the timber left behind contract. Was just cut down, not only up to the needs serving the Royal King's Navy or the railway system that was built in India, or the commercial felling of trees that continued, became a business at the time. The trees were cut down without understanding what did it mean for them to be in the forest. So from here, the story begins of, I would say, consciousness of feminist consciousness, because women were not only dependent and greatly related to forest, their livelihood dependent on forest, their life activities were related to forest, their songs were written and sung around the forest, but they were not as much represented by the trees as they were represented by or related to what Vandana Shiva calls biomass. This is something that has got to be. Biomass of the forest is something that colonial and scientific forestry could not understand, because it was something that will never be converted into, will never become pulp, will not be put to use to commercial use. It will not be sort of meaningful commercial use. And Vandana Shiva writes that obviously the forest was not only these big trees and tall trees, also biomass, the leaves that were falling, weeds that were there. At one point, in a very poetic manner, she said, if you want to talk about politics today, let us think about the weeds. Single weed, for example, has a value as an insect, as Laila was saying, also has ambition to live out its life. They're also full of energy. This life also has a plan to realize its end, then only sort of die off of the way. So perhaps because of this kind of thing that was going on in India, the destruction and the destructive form in which capitalism came to. There is this one woman writer, poet, fiction writer rather, in 1905, Ruqayya Hussain wrote a story which is a big inspirational story for a lot of feminists. It's called Sultana's Dream. And this Sultana's Dream talks about a non-patriarchal, non-capitalist world. It's a reimagination that Craig was talking about also. So things that we know, we still have to reimagine, and what comes out of that reimagination is also quite beautiful and quite life-nurturing. In Sultana's Dream, there's this one who gets a chance to build a new world. And she builds a world which is friendly, which is non-capitalist and non-patriarchal. And the beauty of this imagination is reflected in her plan, in her small plan, big and small plan, is to build a lovely kitchen garden, in which she would grow all kinds of herbs, lined up with dahlia and champa and all these flowers that we have in India. And a house without a kitchen garden, for example, is a house which is not beautiful enough. So you can see the role of these kinds of herbs, flowers, and biomass, as she talks about, in the life of women. In Sultana's Dream, she does not dream about a man whom she would marry and what that man should be like. She's constantly thinking about all the plants, birds, all the nature, in a most imaginable way. That's how she. And that satisfies her new world, which she believes that we. So I would stop here.
If I might jump in, perfect.
Just
Sorry.
stop here, because then I'll come back how this order, this reversed order in imagination of Ruqayya actually becomes a political act on the part of feminists in India when they go to reverse it. That is to say, how to restore the destroyed spaces of not only but of plants of various other kinds of creatures, including insects. No, earlier I was talking about fungi and algae, bacteria. I mean, these are real full concerns of feminists and anybody for that matter who wants to live a full life. Why do you want to live on a planet where you kill off more than half the species, and all you land up with is eucalyptus and all kinds of those kinds of plants which can come easy pulp and timber? That's an impoverished world to live in. That's not a beauty.
Thank you so much, Savita, and thank you to all of our panelists. I think there was a beautiful arc in the speaking together of the papers, and I believe that Pushpa Singh will be able to pull this, Dr. Singh will be able to pull this together for us, so I will pass it over to our discussant now.
A very good evening to all. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So this is indeed a very engaging session on the crucial subject, aesthetics, ecology, and feminism. Different paper by different scholars, including Professor Leonard, Professor Reitz, Professor Pisani, and Professor Singh, provide a spectrum on critical theory of Herbert Marcuse by engaging with the conceptual categories of all these. All the papers highlight the role of global capitalism, modern technology, and a particular vision of development, which is repressive, subordinating, exploitative, and exclusionary. Professor Leonard brought this tension and discomfort between categories like creative innovations and traditional cultural values and cultural inheritance, and how such tensions be reconciled by a larger reform or transformation by defamiliarization. Professor Reitz further emphasized defamiliarization and the possibility of emancipation offered by liberal social order and the revolutionary radical ecology of Marcuse reflected in different movements like student movement, women's movement, ecological movement that offer alternate conceptions of the world. Professor Pisani highlights the violence inherent in all the modern projects of agricultural modernization like Green Revolution. How on the name of agricultural advancement, science and technology is used to establish the hegemony of particular knowledge system or the episteme. However, this knowledge renders all the other forms of knowing and organizing as obsolete or irrelevant, as she has given the examples of glyphosate and others. On the other hand, it is the aesthetic of earth science that provides an alternative, enabling us to see and engage in more constructive ways. Professor Singh illustrates the nuances of politics of eros and ecofeminism by emphasizing the repressive dimension of capitalism as it continues its flourishing and profiteering by exploiting nature and women in different ways. Capitalism's insatiable quest for productivism and the resulting mass production and mass consumption has not only destructed nature, but has huge impingement for women in different ways. As socialist feminists and ecofeminists like Carolyn Merchant, Vanna Shiva already have demonstrated, that the interface of capitalism and patriarchy creates a dual subjugation of nature as well as women. And this is the precise reason that women have been at the forefront of all important environmental movements in India, like Chipko or the Hug Tree movement and so on. In fact, Chipko is seen as the foundational movement that started the modern environmental consciousness in India and in the entire South Asia. Women like Gaura Devi, Bachni Devi has led from the forefront at the different sites of the protest. A recently published book by Shekhar Pathak on Chipko movement provides an alternative or a subaltern account of this movement by tracing the struggle of ordinary people instead of more well-known faces of the movement like Sundar Lal Bahuguna or Chandi Prasad Bhatt. It is such sites of protest and the interventions that offer us the promise of an alternative way of organizing, engaging, and governing ourselves. It is from here that we see the possibilities of emancipation. I must say that all these papers resonate with a very important theme of my own doctoral thesis. And my work has been in the area of agroecology and gender, where I have tried to look at the erosion of seed sovereignty in the light of technological interventions in seed. These interventions lead to institutionalization and commodification of seed under modern agricultural knowledge system. I'm tempted to analyze my own research in the Marcusean framework. One of the very important aspects of Marcuse's work was foregrounding the idea that how technology can be site of repression by becoming a mere tool of capital accumulation. In the commodified society, how an individual is reduced to just a consumer of commodities. In fact, all modern production system embodies the contradiction and alienation of the knowledge creator and the knowledge practitioner. For example, agricultural modernization in India that started from the technological intervention in seed display a dominant technocratic vision of agriculture, as we have seen from the presentation of Professor Pisani also. Seed in itself is seen as devoid of any value, but when it arrives through this technological enhancement, it acquires a great value that could transform the destiny of the farmers. In plant breeding science, the seed is seen as creation of a lab, an isolated entity produced industrially. In this sense, the manufactured seed carry the contradictions of modern production system. Deriving from dominant development models, agricultural development also identifies one characteristic of improved seed, that is of increasing yield, making it the highlight of its achievement without considering how the other variables of production like soil, water, and ecological aspects are going to be impacted over time. It takes other variables of production to be constant, which is not the case in reality. This notion of efficiency is misplaced and makes sense only in a very narrowly defined myopic gaze of assessment of agriculture. The improved seed is projected as efficient vis-a-vis the native seed by foregrounding its productivity. This assessment is narrowly made that not always include a wide range of seeds. A classic example of Cartesian design, this method assesses scientific efficiency by privileging a particular notion of efficiency, which is high productivity of improved seed, over the other notions of efficiency like agronomic resilience, ecological balance, non-dependence on agrochemical inputs, and so on. As with the intervention of modern science, seed increasingly came under the control first of the state under the Green Revolution in India, as in many parts of the world, and now under the contemporary agri-biotechnology. With the intellectual property, patents, and royalty, the rights of ownership to save, share, and exchange seeds have become a punishable offense and a crime. This indicates a subversion of what Professor Pisani calls the earth science, or what many would call an ecological democracy. Hence, the need for an alternative, a politics which is out of not just the state, but also market in some ways. As women have been frontrunner of the agroecological farming and the biodiversity conservation, which has also provided them an agency. Therefore, the requirement of not just strengthening these alternative spaces, but also a much wider engagement is required by mainstreaming them in policies and also within the vision of development itself. With this, I will not take much time and I'll stop here. Maybe I can come in later. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I will, let's give all of our participants a big thank you. And I will now open up the session for questions, or if well, I'll open up for questions and see if we have any from the group. And if there are no immediate burning questions, perhaps any of the speakers can respond to the comments or to each other. I see, Craig, you've got your microphone off. Would you like to go ahead? Or are you just taking it off?
I was just taking off, but I actually did want to offer an idea or some thoughts that extended, I think, connect and link all the topics discussed. And that is the association in relationship to the object. And I just, if I could just present from the perspective of aesthetics, that the attention to objects, as I see it, is the purpose of aesthetics. And that in itself is a practice of care. Objectification, interestingly, with sharing a root word there, it is care's opposite. It's a practice of exploitation. So the relationship to objects is a crucial one. And so when objects themselves are thought of as the non-subject, those things, human and non-human, that are external to us individually. And the implications in terms of aesthetics, or the implications of aesthetics, can be said to be, to really, the implications can be said to affect really everything that constitutes and links us to the external world, including human relationships, human relations, including the environment. And I guess I would say that to echo what Charles pulled out of Marcuse's use of the term, the promesse de bonheur, being this, that aesthetics, all this taken into account, aesthetics is only it's a promise only, it's not a guarantee. And I find that really interesting to me. It's a question to grapple with, that when and where does this aesthetic care, as I've just presented it, not translate to everyday practices? I think that's what troubles me at times and makes me, it's almost the, it's the friction within the within the hope of the aesthetic. And I wonder what that can be at times. Perhaps it's when the individual who practices an attention to care through aesthetics actually becomes an aesthete. You know, when the attention becomes a doctrine or an obsession, and that reverts back to objectification.
Thank you, Craig. Are there other comments or questions along this line from our panelists or our participants?
Well, I could come back in. Do you hear me? Yeah, and I would just like to react to this idea that art is not just a promise. You know, Craig, I think you're emphasizing that art makes gives us an explanation in a way of what is a potential and a power that we may utilize to improve life, to create the future disalienated society. So there is the promise, like we talk about promising students. They've got it, and they're gonna, and that's what art's got it. It helps us find our way forward by disclosing those things about reality that are erased in our immediate everyday one-dimensional consciousness. And if I could go on for a minute, I'd like to say about theory. You know, creative theory, critical theory. Theory is the idea of theory itself is that it's explanatory. Theory needs to help us understand the world. That's, by the way, what education is all about. We're trying to understand the way the world works and the way our societies operate and what it means to be a human being. So I want to emphasize again that when we talk about creativity, you know, all of the presentations here have connected that to critical political economy. We have to understand the foundations, the material foundations of our society, and then develop in our own creative way an elaboration of an aesthetic ethos, an elaboration of a gender free system of human relations, free from inequality and discrimination, so that this is the theory that that we have to think about creatively. And certainly we've seen great examples of that in from Craig and from Maria and from this panel. So, all right, that's just my reaction, my comment on things.
Can I make a quick comment?
We'll go to Lauren. Can we let Maria go, and then you real quick? She's had her hand up.
Oh, okay.
So just next, Lauren.
Okay, thank you. Just something to add to the commentary of Craig. Craig, I think that in this aesthetical idea, we need to move our body. It's the first time. And to move in directions to the places, taking the place we are as the basis to act in these senses, because I think that is very complicated to think as all-seeing eye, you know, talking about the capital or the fights in the world. But what I learned with Marcuse is to be connected with the fight in my territory, even though I need to go to the Amazon, you know, so to be closer to the knowledge that can be creative in some kind of action. So I need what Marcuse opened to me is the necessity to go a little bit more than theory. Theory is the basis, but we need to act in the territory we are. So the promesse de bonheur is a goal, is what moves our erotic impulse. It's not the end. What is important is the process. We have any certification that will be okay, that we will resolve and do the revolution, but we need to act all the day. And this is what inspired me in Marcuse's work.
Go ahead, Lauren, and then Savita.
Yeah, my light isn't lighting. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes, yes, go on.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on, it was a really wonderful session. I just want to pick up on a couple of the comments, really inspired by many of the things that were said and tied to a personal experience. A couple of weeks ago, there was a Monet exhibit at our, not Monet, a Cézanne exhibit at our at our Art Institute. And I was thinking as I was listening to some of the comments that about Marcuse on art. And one of the points that he makes very clearly is that art need not be political in order to be political. That is to say that by seeing the world in a slightly different way, it puts a little bit of a crack in the received knowledge, the hegemonic discourses. And so what I was thinking of is when I thought of the, as I associated to the thing, is much of Cézanne's pictures of landscapes and things like that, where there are no workers being exploited or any or red flags with sickles being raised, but it does show a certain notion of nature, largely of the 19th century, before we get to the advanced agricultural, the mechanization of agriculture that we see today, the use of fertilizers that was discussed so beautifully. And I was thinking, when I began to think this way, my mind also ran to Monet. And in one of his most famous series is The Haystacks. And this is sort of life, the pastoral life before the kind of commercialization of agriculture that we see today, where, what is it, 3 companies in the United States produce 3 billion chickens a year, and the small farmers produce 9 or something like that. But if we contrast that with Monet's pictures of the train station that I think people would be familiar with, at least the aesthetes are, you know, the critical theorists that pay attention to art, where you see those where the main thing that you see, the billowing carbon dioxide spouting out of the trains. This is, you know, late 1800s, early 1900s, as well as the total anonymity of the people. And when we talk about the kind of alienation that, not Marx's discussion of alienation in terms of factory workers, primarily women and children whose nimble fingers could be easily do the looms and lose their fingers in the process, but the extent to which, and here's where Marcuse is so good, taking off of Weber on rationality, of the kind of alienation through commodification, as Charles mentioned, this alienation of throughout the whole society, and this emphasis on more and more and better and better. And what has that given us? Floods in Pakistan, droughts in the West. And if I don't shut up, I never will, because those who know me know that I talk too much.
Hey.
Thank you, Lauren. We'll pass it over to Savita. You're still on mute, Savita.
So for the sake of discussion, I just sort of stopped there. I have to add one more point because I'm speaking from the perspective of creative theory. So again, I come back from that angle. Is that if there is no life, if there is no way of knowing how life gets created, then everything else is basically meaningless. Life is very important. How life regenerates. Again, I go back to Vandana Shiva just to make this point. She thinks, and I agree with her, that nature and forest as an example is life creating. That is to say, life itself becomes the ultimate value. Values are not created only in the market through commodity exchange. Value is created through production of life itself. This has to be understood, and this is where the communist politics becomes the terrain of politics. That is to say, if you treat biomass, which is the flora and fauna around the forest, as something like waste, which is not useful. It's not useful commercially, perhaps, but it is where the life is for women and for people who are dependent on life of the forest. You have to understand the forest, how it works. You have to understand the simplest way, the things that are ordinary, life regenerates itself there. In that sense, if capitalism recognizes only one value, that is by exchange value, then it is obviously very destructive of life as such. So the biomass also stands for what she calls diversity. Jungle or forest is never alone. It supports and it is part of also water bodies. It's part of a certain kind of climate, some sort of wind. All of that is life. And it is this that one needs to understand. She redefines the notion of production, regeneration, life extension, nurturing. So I think to a very large extent, even though she's inspired by Herbert Marcuse himself, she admits it. In her book with Maria Mais, Feminism, there is a chapter in which they together write that chapter in which they say that in Germany how they experimented with Marcuse, and they developed a wasteland into life-giving plot of land, soil change, the new plantation, nurture and care and all that. Everything changed. And we see it all the time. We bring care to us, even to a garden. That becomes a very different. So I think it's important for us to understand how life itself gets created, extended, and value of this life is much more than value. This is something that feminists is bent on. That's where the politics also. What I want.
Thank you, Savita. Manindra, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. One is a question, other is a comment. I think the question is, what are the different forms of human beings and nature relationship? Capitalism has thrown one form of relationship, which I think was accepted widely by all of us and probably still being accepted. Is there any alternative model of this relationship that you have in mind, either existing in some form somewhere or in our imagination, that how do we engage with nature in a way that it can take care of the human population along with other living beings and non-living beings. So that is one question that I think could be formulated in a different way. That is, who owns nature? I'm sure there are multiple traditions, like one of our friends who is working on tribal epistemology, who suggests that tribals in India have seen nature very differently. They do not see nature as resources. They see nature as a habitat, and therefore there are customs, traditions, rituals, modes of engaging with nature, which is very democratic. So it's not destruction of nature, extracting things for survival, but simultaneously being conscious that nature reproduces itself. So one question is this: what are the experiments going on globally? I mean, in India, I can see 3-4 interesting experiments that have been taking place, and they're interesting. The other question is that when we are talking about all this, and these are two related questions, do we have anything to offer beyond industrial revolution ethos? Have we really conceptualized what happened in the period of industrialization? How our approach to nature has changed so much? And if we have formulated, or if Marcuse has to offer any serious model which could be or which has been experimented or could be experimented in different parts of the world. I can think of Gandhi, and there are a lot of common grounds between Gandhi and Marcuse, who suggest that nature has enough for need, but not for greed. And greed, I think, became one of the core principles of capitalism, as many reports on 2008 economic crisis suggest that greed was the reason for the crisis. But greed is so essential to the entire process or system. So how do we get out of it? So what could be the alternative way of engaging? I mean, Gandhi suggested that don't take more than what you need to survive. But I'm sure it's very difficult proposition to follow, and need itself then difficult to be defined. So my one, let me precisely put to you. One is that what are the alternative models available? And second is that what could be alternative model that is being thought of by either critical theory or creative theory. There is a person who is not present here, who has worked on water, and she's working on river now. She has something to offer, but I wish I could have included her in this meeting.
Would anyone from the panel like to? Charles, was that?
Yeah, let me chime in to say that as I understand it, today there is a referendum going on in Chile on a new constitution, and this proposed constitution emphasizes the need to care for the environment and the rights of the forest and the fish and the etc. There and if this passes, it will enshrine in the Constitution a protection of the environing living things that, again, are not to be seen as resources, but more as relatives. And the Constitution of Ecuador has already been revised and built in those kinds of ideas. So let me though go to the next point, the issue of care. It's important to understand that yes, all of us require the care of our parents in order to become humane human beings. Care, however, in capitalist society is twisted and perverted. You only give care to matters of business. You give great care to matters of business, but matters of human relations, hey, treat human beings as if they are commodities to be bought and sold at the lowest wage. The way you lower the wage of the world's workers is to use industrial production of wheat and corn, so to make it cheaper to reproduce the world's workforce. When I was talking about theory, I'm talking about philosophy, that Marx got to the core predicament philosophically, that we have this, he called it a fetish of we've got to have more capital accumulation instead of having more common wealth, more common work, more cooperation, more leisure, more peace. So that's the core perversion of our capitalist society.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Please.
Yeah. It is true that Marcuse's criticism of a capitalist society in the form of one-dimensionality is still very valid. But what he talks about is, behind all this is the technological rationality. And he also envisions the alternative vision of technological rationality. So that is some sort of aestheticization of the rationality. But is he not confusing between the understanding of nature, the scientific study of nature, with the life experience of nature? Because in the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory itself, Habermas and Feinberg have criticized Marcuse for confusing the two. There is no alternative from instrumental technical rationality in the understanding and in the scientific enterprise of understanding nature. But we can think about some sort of alternative technology. The thing is, Habermas would say that this technological rationality is valid in one sphere, but it is not valid in other spheres. And he talks about communicative rationality, where all these panelists place Marcuse's understanding of alternative technological rationality in this context. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mariella.
I will try. I would like to connect the two questions, and especially I was touched by this critique of that Habermas did to Marcuse, because when I read that when I was, I don't know, 10 years ago, I remember my surprise with this affirmation of Habermas, as we have not another conception of nature. To me, this is understandable, because here in Brazil, we have many kinds of relationship with this European word named nature. In many communities here, nature is a subject, and each subject has a name and a function specific in different contexts. The word nature is in itself a problem to us. We will never have a completely notion of nature. Maybe why I am trying to do is to see in each context what kind of a political discourse the notion nature produce. For example, we can analyze the Disney World films and to tell something about what nature is, or we can follow this world to see different political fights around there. And I think that one of I would like to suggest the reread of the notion of nature inside the science, the science knowledge. Like, for example, James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis. Lynn Margulis has a very interesting notion because it functions, the scientific knowledge, the technique, but to the scientist, the reductionist science, they wanted to take around the notion of Gaia. They don't like Gaia. We don't talk about Gaia, but the technique is okay. So what's important to the Gaia theory is the notion that competition is not natural in the evolution of our species or in the planet. If we analyze the planet in these 4 billion of years, and we are a little part of this history, we can see that the death and the competition is not the end of a big process of syntropy. Entropy is just interesting if you understand entropy as part of syntropy, and syntropy is the goal to make life every time more. So I like very much the phrase of James Lovelock when he told it to us, if you don't take care of ourselves, the earth will do something to follow the life without us. It's a very hard expression, but is nice to understand our place here. That is not control the earth. We will not control the earth. We will be eliminated before that.
Thank you. Thank you. Would anyone like to jump into the conversation now?
I don't know what I don't know what Manindra was asking, but Manindra, there is a whole lot of relationship feminists have forged with nature, and it's a very distinctly different kind of relationship. That is what I was talking about. For example, look at Vandana Shiva, how she talks about feminine forestry. And it's a new way of, it's another way of, not new of course, but another way of relating with nature. That is to say, understand nature as a living thing. Understand nature as life-giving, as having life itself, herself. The invisible relationship she has with people who depend on her or whom she supports. The organic relationship she has formed with people who understand her. So all the politics, feminist politics, is based on this altered of relating to nature. I mean, sundered with nature, we separated ourselves from nature during this extraordinary industrial period that begins the modernity and so on. There was not basically much difference in understanding how nature worked. A lot of people understood intuitively as to how nature works, and they adjusted accordingly. You know, in Orissa, Professor Mohanty will be able to tell us. You know, the poets from the tribal parts of Malyangiri and all those places, the kinds of poetry that they write, you feel as if they know nature. They talk about birds, they talk about parrots, they talk about all kinds of trees as if they're living beings, and their feelings are in fact depicted in poetry. So we are so, we've become so used to bereft from nature, separated from her, objectification of nature and its destruction, that we do not think that there are processes which are going on still. And feminism, ecofeminists, I think, have a distinct vision of which, if we do not destroy, continue to destroy in this deep manner, she will be able to regenerate herself. Again, follow her own nature of supporting various millions of creatures that are.
Can I briefly also come in here? To engage with Professor Thakur's question, there have been already the alternative ways in which there has been a relationship between human beings and nature. I think there's a particular moment with the beginning of modernity and with the beginning of Newtonian science that nature has been started to be looked in a certain way, in the sense of just being, certain asset to be harnessed with the help of modern science. So prior to that, in most of the societies across the world, not just the global south, but in most of the societies across the world, they have certain ways of living which was more harmonious, in the sense where there is an understanding of nature having a value in itself. And the whole understanding that human beings' existence also depends on this, this harmony. It's not just the Anthropocene, in the sense that not just that human beings gaze that defines nature, but how there has to be a more holistic way of this thing. And on the whole question of feminist, perspective, which connects to Professor Savita Singh's, what she was right now arguing, that, also there is already a conception about the relationship between nature and technology and knowledge system, which is on the ground being practiced by several women. And of course, Varna Shiva has been talking at length about all these, in her different works. But while I was, because Professor Singh also talked about Orissa, and I happened to do my fieldwork in 5 districts in Orissa. And I found that all these women who are engaged in agroecological farming there, they have a whole conception of biocultural conception of seed, where seed is not just seen as, one of a material asset, but also a whole set of other cultural identity, gastronomic palatability, all these facts associated with seed. And that's why before every seed meeting, it is worship. So that also reflects another way of habitation with nature, another way of, looking at nature, which is being practiced by women. So therefore, it is in that sense that we can see the alternatives, which is not just in the vision, but which is being already existing in the reality, which is out there. And many communities, and more so women in all these communities, they're already practicing them through their different ways, by engaging with the forest, by engaging with agroforestry, by engaging with different ways of farming, which is also reflective of their alternative knowledge systems. So I would stop here. Sorry, I am just discussing, but this is such a lovely discussion going on here that I felt tempted to just jump in.
I'm glad you did. Thank you.
May I just? Please. Yeah, I think, thank you very much for the information. My related worry is, there are several such experiments that I also know, including Vandana Shiva. How far these experiments are scalable, how far this can replace, how much they have potential to replace the dominant mode of engagement with nature. Is there any philosophical, theoretical engagement with these kind of, I know one such movement, the Mondragon movement, which I consider as possible alternative to capitalism emerging. The relation with technology has not been that much defined, or nature not defined, but human relations have been defined, and the new ethos value system have been created to make a sustainable society. But I'm worried, I'm curious that such experiments being done at various places, are they scalable? One, do they have potential to replace what is our central problem today? I mean, neoliberal capitalism. Are they throwing any serious challenge to neoliberal capitalism? Or neoliberal capitalism is, and Vandana Siva's, this thing is not throwing any major challenge to neoliberal capitalism. I'm just wondering. So that would be my concern.
We have one example from the chat that was put in there. So I just want to draw everyone's attention.
Yes, this is a very interesting example and very contradictory because big supermarkets are using this agroecological technique in many places in Brazil. But we can be sure that this kind of technique can keep the relation between microbeans, biomass, and they can improve a really better condition to the climate and to the people too. And the example is very interesting because this scientist, Ernest Gott, he has one of the most important farm of cacao, cacao of chocolate is the more valorized in the actions in the financial capital. So it's very contradictory, but is a scientific technique that can show results to us. And the first time he applied it was in Haiti after a war. So he's very engaged to go to the places that is really, really poor and to do something with that. But it's a big change, but it's a little hope too.
Thank you. Go ahead, Savita.
Again, to come back to Manindra. Vandana Shiva's impact can be measured. I wanted to have some scalable thing, can be measured by the fact that in areas where India had begun to grow eucalyptus and poplar trees, now you have local trees, local variety of seeds being used in agriculture. And that has made women come back to agriculture, come back to forest. And I'm talking about the entire coastal region where fishery, for example, was affected because the same destructive mechanized ways of fishing. That's why it has stopped. All those people who were working in that area, the poor fishing community, they have their resources back. They only fish according to the needs of the community, and whatever little profit that they make, live out their lives, just eking out their lives. There was a time when the modern forest, international forest, had thought of eucalyptization of our forests. That process has been reversed. Today, our forests are under military siege brought about by the national government. We didn't want to go into all this right now, but let me tell you that at the moment, what is going on in India is militarized primitive accumulation. And now it's not a matter of trees and plants, it's a matter of digging, it's a matter of mining. You know what kind of struggle tribals of India, Odisha, have waged against this kind of encroachment. If you want to go to Chhattisgarh today, I went myself, gone for some seminar, and I wanted to see the jungles of Chhattisgarh, and I was not allowed to go because guarded by the military force of Indian government. So whatever women can do, whatever communities that are affected by this kind of destruction of ecology, and I said millions of people were affected. Let me give you examples. Forget about Vandana Shiva. Think of Medha Pathak. Think of the struggle and movement that has gone on in this country against the big dams. Think of how long this particular movement has gone on, and people have been with the movement. No matter if they have lost, they've lost. The struggle went on. The issues of Adivasis and indigenous people of that region, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Madhya Pradesh, all came into the light. And she has not only raised this particular huge movement, she has been part of the land grab, for example, the real estate. They are also destroying the land because they are taking the land of these people only, and they're building cities of the kind which require a lot of water, and it is the water of the peasants that they are depriving them of. So if you look at the way nature particularly is under attack from modernizing forces, from World Bank resources. I mean, think of it, the global capital is encroaching on these lands. And I think that feminists of India have waged a very courageous battle, and they have shown people that new relationship with nature is in ways of living is. And it is not so much greed, it is the very logic, the productivist logic of capitalism that one has to fight. It is not shown as greed, it's shown as technologically viable, technologically monitored and required, necessary movement. I mean, only if you think that is profit, yes, profit indeed, but simultaneously, as we were talking about technology, development of technology, look at from where we have gone to this stage.
These critiques, we know, Savita. The point is, that is not the point I'm making. We all know that these are very serious critiques of existing models. What I'm saying is, what I'm worried about is that, sorry, we can finish it off. Sorry. Should I stop? Sorry. We keep
I think go ahead and finish, and then we'll take a last comment from Lauren.
May I add a little?
Who is that?
May I add a little to the conversation? Just a few seconds.
Okay, we'll take these three, and then we'll wrap up the session. After that, I know we're already over time.
I find that what Manindra is saying and what Savita ji is saying, they are all having their own perfect points. Savita ji is pointing out the courageous struggle of feminists and Veda Patekar and others, and in the Chipko movement everywhere. But the question is, can these struggles, these micro level struggles, replace the macro level problem of power and profit for which technology is being used by the industrial military complex and the state? Unless and until technology is controlled by the democratic process of choice making by the people, this macro level technological choice of exploitation of labor and looking at nature in a very exploitative way is not possible. So these struggles are going on, the movements are going on, but can they replace the larger question of technological exploitation and technological rationality leading the whole societal setup and the human relationships? Thank you.
Thank you. So Lauren, we'll give you the last comment before we wrap up this fantastic
quick comments for me. Number one, as a Marxist, there's a materialist point here that should be under that was kind of alluded to. In pre-modern societies, in fact, pre-horticultural societies where people were hunting and gathering, it was women who gathered approximately 80% of the food that the society consumed, because the source of protein, whether it was fish or animals, was always intermittent. So it was the gathering of berries and edible plants and things like that women had produced. Secondly, as a critical theorist, that many have argued that many of the critical theorists have argued. There's a wonderful book by Lease called The Domination of Nature, a little bit old now, but it's still pretty important. Oh, you know the book, Sarah. Okay. Anyhow, that the first form of domination was man and I emphasize man's domination over nature, because part and parcel of that domination over nature was the domination over women. And once men could own a plot of land, to kind of look at Rousseau's notion of putting a fence around the land, saying, keep out, this means you, this land is my land and not yours, that once men had the superior upper body strength to hold a plow down, that began the downfall of equality between genders and the emergence of classes. But there is a sort of dialectic, and I think some of the people in some of the critical theorists have pointed out that it's not to attribute consciousness to nature, but there does seem to be a dialectic. And let's think of what happened when Prometheus stole fire from the gods. As many of you know, at least Western culture, at least Greek culture, he had a really bad liver problem for a very, very long time. Secondly, when Daedalus and Icarus decided that they were going to short circuit the airline industry and fly by themselves, they flew high enough to the heat of the sun that melted the wax holding their feathers on, and they plummeted to earth. So to a certain extent, I think what we're really seeing, if we want to be poetic about something that's not very beautiful, that much of what's going on in the world today, and in India, you're close to Pakistan, where 1,300 people have died from the floods. I don't have to tell you, in the United States, we've hit some record temperatures. There is this notion that our ecological devastation, our exploitation of nature, we're paying a price for it. And that price may very well be, to finish on an upside note, the end of humanity. Thank you.
Lauren, you took us from hopeful to less hopeful, and
I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist. You know, anybody. I think that the young kids are all ecologically. You know, the trouble is, will they get political power before the world ends?
Yeah.
I don't want to say any more. We have to end. Wonderful session, guys, gals.
Thanks, Lauren. And I think that ties well with our previous session for those folks that were listening to the role of the university, and we're thinking about critical education, and we're thinking about students today. I think the session took a really lovely kind of path, like a path down a river, thinking about, I think the central thing that I'm also hearing was this idea of care. I think everyone, and care of objects, care of self, care of each other, and what it means to have feminist forms of care, or Marxist forms of care, or alternative forms of thinking about the world around us that doesn't have to be colonized by the term nature in the Western concept, right? That there have been and are other existing possibilities and ways to think about ourselves and our relationship with the environment. And I think Marcuse was always pushing that, right? Saying that the people that are outside of these colonized boundaries, that have the ability to think differently about the world around them, are often ones we should be turning to those alternative visions, or that alternative way of thinking that art can also, and aesthetics can also inspire us to do so, as Craig pointed out. I would like to thank everyone for such a fantastic discussion. I know it's late in India. This is the CAP event on a big day, and there's more to come tomorrow. I would like to thank our presenters. I hope you reach out to them if you have additional questions and comments, and I hope to keep the conversation going. I'm very excited to see the unification of these two groups, or bringing together the International Herbert Marcuse Society, all of whom presented today are very involved in the society. Andy Lamas, as one of the co-coordinators, is happy to always provide more information too, as a hub for that. And I just like to thank everyone, and I wish everyone a good afternoon, a good evening, and a good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Goodbye. Good night.
Good night.
Bye, Marilia.
Bye, Savita. Bye, Sarah. You miss me.
I miss seeing you. It's so good to see you.
Yes, it would be a good moment to go to a restaurant to drink something, but not stay here. Bye-bye.
Most definitely.
Nice.
Bye, Craig.
Thank you, everyone.
Good, Craig.
Bye. Good
Thanks,
night.
Craig.
Thanks for seeing for the first time. You have been communicating. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Savita, see you tomorrow.
See you. Yeah.
Bye.